The starvation of angels. Soft beeping from my alarm woke me that morning. The same sound as always, a pulsing of noise that was like a heartbeat. Over the years, I'd grown used to the noise signifying another day at the station. I was positive about my lack of work, but I could just feel some new and horrific case would be looming over me soon. Turning my clock off to prevent it waking my slumbering wife, I pulled myself out of bed and got dressed. I had breakfast and read the news. Old cases printed on the cover. Almost in sync with my need to get up and head over to the station, a knock came at my door. Back to the grind, I hummed as I kicked my shoes on. On opening the door, I found my work partner, a spry woman in her late 30s with curly red hair pulled back into a ponytail. She wore a light brown coat and a sweet smile. "Morning, Harrison," she chirped before pushing a coffee into my hands. "Boys want you over at Saints Lane apartment block. Seems they've found a body." I took the coffee from her, same one she gave me every day, and sipped it. About time we got some more work. Smiling, I closed the front door and headed to her car. Sharon Whittingham, to give her full name, was a detective like me. I trained her and was expecting her to move to a new city once she was trained, since she had the skills to go far. But she, like most people who live here, stayed. Within half an hour, we'd arrived. The complex we found ourselves at was the kind people tell of in ghost stories. Old, damp, and half-empty. It was once a low-cost housing ideal from about 50 years ago. But the only thing it kept after countless contractors had pulled out was the low cost. A few squad cars were already outside, their lights flicking on and off rhythmically. From what Sharon had told me, we knew the body was that of a young male, about 23 years old. We were trying to hunt for his family, but as yet didn't have many leads. I ran through the notes in my head as we ascended the 4 flights of stairs, up to room 307. Yellow and black tape was hung about the place, stopping the other dozen residents of the complex from getting in. The door had been broken in by our own forces in an attempt to see what the source of the foul smell in the complex was. Little had been disturbed in the apartment itself. A few things like pillows were on the floor, but nothing to suggest a struggle. Sharon headed into the bedroom of the apartment and nodded her head towards the body. Grimly, I followed her in. There, lying naked on the bed, was a young man with black hair, green eyes, and a few studs. His body was a mess. Most of his chest had been pulled open, and the lungs and heart partially removed, clawed out by long nails. Though his death looked horrific, the young man had a peaceful look on his face. "What a sorry sight," I commented, walking over to the body to take a closer look at the gaping wound in his chest. "That's what I said." Sharon nodded, looking around the bedroom. "This case looks like an odd one. I mean, just look at this room. It's immaculate, not a thing out of place. It doesn't look like there was a struggle to me." I nodded in agreement before looking at the man's side table to inspect it for clues. I pulled some gloves on and started to leaf through his possessions. "Has anyone reported hearing a disturbance here in the past few weeks?" "No. The kid hardly made any noise, it seemed. He moved in a few years ago. Didn't go out much or have many people over." "Do we have a name?" Yeah, I think so. He called himself Joshua Brown. He was working near here, at a restaurant as a waiter." "I see." I moved back from the small bedside cabinet, making note of a framed photo by the lamp. The image was of the boy, Joshua, in his late teens, with another boy with long white hair, snowy skin, and a pink jumper. They looked happy together. Just as I was about to stand, I noticed a few empty packets of contraceptives on the floor. I picked them up carefully and placed them into a clear plastic bag before showing them to Sharon. "Do you think he knew his killer?" Sharon eyed me for a moment. She always said I had an odd way with words. "Well, he could have done it with his killer before he met his maker, so to speak." She pondered for a moment before spotting the photograph. If we look at it from that angle, it's totally plausible. We should try to see who he knew, who his friends and lovers were. Unless it was a one-night stand, of course. I nodded and wandered around the room some more. Get someone to look into his mobile phone records, computer, and whatever other communication device he has. That'll be a good first lead. We should also be able to get some DNA from this place, if we need to identify. You talk like such an old man sometimes. Sharon smiled. If we get this to court, we should be able to prove who did it. We just need to find the one who did the deed. I stifled a chuckle. You talk like a teenager sometimes, Sharon. I knew full well my comeback had no effect. Let's hope we can get whoever did this. As if we ever let them get away. I smiled at her optimism and continued my search. As expected, a good number of DNA samples were recovered and sent off to the lab, while Sharon and I spoke to his neighbors to see if anyone knew Joshua. They all said the same thing. As far as they knew, he was a very quiet lad, though his appearance may have suggested otherwise. He was kind, didn't talk about himself or his family much. We were still finding it hard to get in contact with his parents, or the boy in the photo, whoever he was. The few photos around Joshua's flat were almost all of the albino teenager, and we guessed they'd probably been partners at some point. Working on that assumption, we'd started to construct a story that the two had probably split up or moved apart, but had met up again recently, and the albino had, after intercourse, killed Joshua. It was a little flimsy, but we had to start somewhere. It was long after 11 that night that I finally took a taxi home. In the heat of the moment, I'd lost myself in work, and I'd lost all track of time. Only when I saw it was so late did I at last leave. I arrived home and was met by my darling wife. Even now, 43 years after first meeting her at college, she hasn't lost her looks in my eyes. Even after she had her first stroke, I still loved her looks. They do say love is blind after all. Good evening, love, I said with a soft voice. You could say that me and my wife, Annabelle, were the ideal model of what an old married couple should be, still as close as ever. Though I now had a full head of silver hair, I hadn't retired. After my wife's first stroke, she'd wanted our lives to stay the same. She stayed at home and rested while I went to work. I loved my work, and the money it brought in helped to pay the medical bills. Evening, my wife replied after a short pause. How was work today? I embraced her and smiled, not giving her an answer other than a happy moan. Annabelle hugged me back, smiling. I hated telling her about my work, the death I saw, so I hid it from her. For the rest of the evening, we simply ate dinner and watched TV, before falling asleep at about 1 a.m. The next day started the same. My alarm started softly to raise me from slumber, and then I left to greet Sharon. She filled me in on some of the developments that had happened since we spoke last. The body had been moved from the apartment, and we were now free to do a deep search. Joshua's laptop had been found and was in the lab, being pulled apart for information. I needed confirmation that nothing had been missed, so I rode with Sharon to the apartment. The place was quiet as we went in, the smell of damp stronger than ever now. On entering the apartment, we found that little was out of place, thanks to the hands of our experienced team. I started to look about, first going through the kitchen and then the living room, followed by the bathroom, then the bedroom, looking in more detail than I had done before. I made a note that the kitchen was poorly stocked to feed 2 people, and that the only clothes belonged to Joshua. Sharon and I quickly came to the same conclusion, that he was living alone at the time of his death. My gaze turned back to the bed. Most of the covers had been taken away, but there was still some dried blood on the mattress, outlined by tape to show where the body once lay. I looked at Sharon, who was rummaging through the dresser to the right of the small window, that gave light to the room. On top of the dresser, there were a number of small trinkets, including a photograph of the albino boy, a freestanding cross with a rosary hung about it, and a copy of the Bible. "See anything, Sharon?" I asked, slowly walking over to look over her shoulder. "Well, he was into his religion, but it looks normal enough." She pondered, tapping the side of her neck in thought. I nodded in agreement, coupling this with a small noise to signify I thought she was indeed correct. "I'd like to know who the albino boy is. He looks to be a bit of a theme here. Possible suspect? I can't be sure until we find him, but it's within reason." I picked up the photograph and removed it from its frame. For a moment I studied the image before noticing something as I held it to the light. Dark patches. Careful to not damage the deceased's possessions, I turned the image over to see writing on the back. It read like a love letter, short, sweet, and simple. "It was sunny that day. Like the sun, you light up my day, my angel," I quoted aloud. Sharon looked back at me in puzzlement for a moment, before realizing I was reading something. "Is there something on the back of the photograph?" With a nod, I handed over the image. "No name, sadly." Like me, Sharon studied the writing. At least we know now that the two of them were dating. A bit tacky, if you ask me. I chuckled. "When you find love, you'll learn that there is no such thing as tacky." "You know full well I have no intention of finding love," Sharon responded flatly. She'd explained to me before that she wasn't interested in any kind of relationship that wasn't work of friend-based. She enjoyed her solitude. "We'll see," I smiled back before going to inspect the other images. "Let's try and find the name of the albino boy. That's our first task." Sharon agreed before hunting about for more photos to see if any others had messages on the back. Sadly, we were out of luck. After collecting a few more of the young man's possessions, we headed back to the station to try fit the links together and to wait on the labs to give up more information. It was past 4 when I got a call from the station's pathologist, a towering blonde-haired man we all lovingly called R. He was from Russia and had one of those very tricky names with a great number of K's and V's in it. He told us he had news about the body and asked us to come over as soon as we could make it. I told Sharon, and we headed over to his lab on the other side of town. R was a workaholic like myself, and often pulled all-nighters against his better judgment. We headed into the small clinic and were buzzed into the main lab by R's young receptionist. R greeted us at the entrance to his lab. His long blonde hair was pulled back into a ponytail that often sat on his shoulder. His eyes were a soft blue and he wore a long white lab coat. On his right wrist, he had a small gold bangle, which I'd never seen him remove. His skin was very white, and he often wore a somewhat blank expression, the kind you see on the face of someone who's lived with death for many years. I saw myself in R sometimes. "Harrison, Sharon, glad you could make it over here so quickly." R smiled, holding out a hand. I took his hand and shook it. "Well, you know what we're like, eager to get things done. Good to see you again." R had worked for us for about a year now. Before that he was a GP, a very good and caring one too, but after a tragedy struck his family he started to work here. Sharon also shook R's hand before heading towards his lab. R smiled in my direction to thank me for the pleasantries. I knew he wasn't a talker. I followed and looked over to a metal table that presented the body of the victim, covered with a thin white sheet. What I found was pretty interesting, really. A bit of a sick case, though, the doctor commented, before pulling the cover down to reveal the upper half of body, folding the cover just under the wound in his chest. "What do you mean?" Sharon asked, walking over to look, while I admired from afar. As I see it, his ribcage was pulled open, and then most of the ribs removed, followed by the consumption of the lungs and heart. There was a dumbfounded silence. You mean someone's eaten him? Sharon shouted, a little too loudly for R's liking, as he was very sensitive to sound. Yes, eaten, R responded, a little agitated to have had Sharon shout at him. There are both large claw and bite marks on the remaining tissue. He signaled to a mouth-sized bite mark, consisting of many needle-like holes that was uncovered at the bottom of the rib cage. I felt a little ill just thinking about the notion of one human eating another. Those aren't human, though. I mean, look at them, Sharon exclaimed, as shocked as I was. Well, these bites come in sets of 2, and they're the right proportion to be human. Say the one doing the eating had possession of some kind of adapted weapon. Humans are strange creatures, you know. R's eyes, peering over his glasses, remained on the body. I paused. He did have a point after all. Maybe this was a far more twisted story than I'd first imagined. For the rest of the meeting, R filled us in on what else he'd worked out about the body and gave us his full report. After reading through the case notes, Sharon and I both headed home. Annabelle met me at the door, and we chatted about our day, though I made sure to cut out as much of the gore as I could. I picked at my dinner and avoided mention of food for the most of the evening. Honestly, I was shaken by what R had told me, so much so that I could hardly respond to my wife. Around 10, I went to bed, although I couldn't sleep. With the case on my mind, it was hard to think of anything else. Ideas rattled around my head. I arrived at the station by 7, a little early for me, but I felt like walking. There's something about walking, to arrive before anyone else, that's strangely enjoyable. By lunchtime, Joshua's journal was released from the labs, with every page copied and recorded. Sharon went out again to ask around about the young man while I stayed put to read the journal. It was a few years old, but I thought it would still be in the right time span to possibly include information about the albino. I was right to assume it would. The journal was nothing special. It went from the teen's 15th birthday and stopped at his 16th. It started with the boy describing what he got for his birthday, a phone, the book he was writing in, and a few trinkets from one of his friends. He spoke highly of his friend, who I gather was known as Lyat. If Lyat was the name of the albino boy, then it should be easy enough to find him. After all, there can't be too many kids called Lyat in the US. For the next few hours or so, I focused on nothing but the journal, making sure to take notes on pretty much everything about the teen's life that he wrote about. To my disappointment, there wasn't much of interest apart from a few briefly mentioned cases of bullying, some underage sex between the young Joshua and Lyat, and a few small social events that he and Lyat had attended. Joshua seemed to be very close to Lyat. He seemed to love him deeply, although it was mentioned that the boys never told their parents. The journal told of how Lyat was badly bullied at school and suffered depression, as well as some other health problems. He took a lot of medications, an amount I'd consider to be unsafe. As the journal went on, things remained the same. The two lads to date in secret, and they kept their heads down at school to avoid attention. Slowly, I closed the journal with care before noticing that Sharon had come in. "Hey, Harrison, how's tricks?" she inquired, coming over with some lunch. Gladly, I took it from her. Well, it looks like we have a name to match a face now. It seems from the journal that Joshua was dating a boy named Lyat, around the age of 16, and it looks like a long-term relationship to me. Sharon picked up the book and started to skim it, along with my notes. "Reckon we've got our suspect's name?" "Seems so." "Well then, let's put it into the computer." Triumphantly, Sharon collected the notes from the desk before heading over to the computer. Though my old legs had fallen asleep from the long time sitting, I raised myself and headed after her. By the time I arrived, Sharon had sat herself down at a computer and was punching in her login. Before long, our files were open and the hunt was on. As expected, it didn't take long at all, although what I saw filled me with disappointment. Lyat Penhart, a white-haired male from a small town in Texas, was found guilty today of murder-suicide. The youngster, age 17, shot dead his father, the town's resident priest, on Monday, the 17th of February. The verdict of the court can now bring answers to those affected by the event. Sharon sighed deeply, reading aloud the article that was before her. Looks like we went down the rabbit hole on this one, Chief. I nodded, although I remained transfixed by the article. It was simple, with little detail, but there was a mention of 3 older brothers, a mother in her 40s, and the cause of death for both Lyatt and his father. His father was shot in the chest and later died at hospital, while Lyatt shot himself in the head. Poor thing. Yup, back to square one it seems, Sharon commented. We'll find other leads, we can do this. I smiled, knowing this had probably knocked the wind out of Sharon's sails. She has this habit of sticking to one idea in a case, and only gives up on it if she is proven wrong. I know. For a moment she just pretended to read the article before stopping herself, leaning close to the screen. You reckon Joshua would have known Lyatt's brothers? What do you mean? Well, Joshua's boss told me he was a bit of an introvert. He never really went out and hardly ever talked to anyone. Since the other residents in Joshua's complex never saw him with anyone, is it safe to assume that he knew the killer, since he wouldn't really invite a random stranger in? Say one of Lyatt's brothers came to town. Joshua offers them a place to stay, and then the rest is history. Sharon knew herself this could be a little bit far-fetched, but I knew she'd look into it. Find the family then. See if we can get more information, I suggested. Got it. On that, Sharon started to dig into our computers for more information about the family while I simply went to work organizing the files for this case, hoping to see a fresh trail. I arrived home at 7 again that night. I greeted my lovely wife and sat with her at the dining table. Though her mind was sometimes muddled and she wasn't always entirely there, I could see she was pretty excited today. Interested as to why this was, I slipped it into conversation over our beef stew. How was your day then, Annabelle? I smiled, happy in the knowledge that she seemed better today than she'd been in a long time. The doctors had warned of another stroke if she became stressed or was too active, so she often confined herself to the house, doing very little at all. It was as if she'd been prescribed loneliness. But some days she was happy to live like this. Oh, my day was lovely. She smiled, looking up from her meal. A very nice boy came over today. He was collecting for charity. Did you give them anything? I asked back, knowing my wife was a very generous person. Well, she said after a little pause, he was looking to collect clothes, so I gave him some of the shirts that are too small for you now, as well as some change. I tried to invite him in for cake and sandwiches. Her mind trailed off for a moment before she smiled. I invited him in for tea, but when he came in, he didn't eat anything, though he did say he was hungry. Odd boy. Often my wife would repeat her sentences, forgetting what she'd just said. That's nice. I've been meaning to get rid of thought shirts for a while now. I smiled. There was something about talking like this that always helped me get my mind off work. I allowed the conversation to continue until we'd finished dinner. Then we watched TV and went to bed, just like most nights. It was a simple lifestyle, but I wouldn't ask for any other. For the next few days, nothing happened of much note. All 3 Penhart brothers had alibis for the night of the murder, and so did the now single mother. Joshua's parents told us that their son hardly ever spoke to them, but they would come and collect his body soon. We found a few more leads, though they all ran cold sooner or later. The IT department was still working on the computer and the phone of the deceased. It was late. Few lights were on in the city, but I still burned the midnight oil working through statement after statement about the young man. Every one of them said the same thing. Joshua never talked to anyone, never had anyone over, and pretty much never left his apartment, apart from when he went to work or went shopping. I was at a loss. Knock, knock, hummed a familiar voice, baritone and tinted with accent. I looked up and saw R in the doorway, holding a few files. Like me, he was burning the midnight oil, though it was a little odd to see him in my office. I welcomed him in. "Evening, doctor." R came in, sitting across from me at my desk, before taking my notes to read over them. "Shouldn't you be at home with your wife now?" "Though I'd love to. I'm at a loss here, R. I'm not the man I was 30 years ago." He smiled, I watching him read over my notes before taking a look at the file he'd brought with him. "Didn't expect to see you here so late. I wanted to hand over these notes. I've found some bits and bobs." He paused. "Where are you with the case?" I knew full well that R would not be willing to tell me anything about his finds unless I told him mine. He liked to trade information. It was one of his many odd tricks. "Well, we've closed the case on trying to find the albino kid. Turns out our top suspect has been dead for years. We can't find any new leads. This job looks like it was done professionally, R, and I'm starting to wonder if we can solve it." I knew full well I was putting it on thick, being a pessimist, but I wanted to go over the top. "The albino kid?" Sharon mentioned him over some drinks. She was so hyped up about finding the supposed killer so quickly. I didn't want to tell her. "Tell her what?" I asked in response. "Don't you know? I thought you looked into the Penhart incident." "No, I thought it was an open-shut case. Was it not?" R smiled knowingly. He always reveled in knowing things that others didn't. "Not totally. The trial was a shambles. Evidence was lost, statements pulled out, and reports rejected. Originally, it was going to be presented as a case of retaliation, an act of self-defense, with the remaining parent standing trial for domestic abuse, but it was not to be." Closing the files he was reading, I watched a rather smug smile creep across the tall doctor's face. "Lyatt's body went missing." I paused, half annoyed that I hadn't been told, but then also confused. "Went missing?" It sounded foolish, but R didn't usually lie. Yep, I knew the pathologist who was going to make an assessment of Lyatt's body before laying him to rest, but the night before she was going to make the report, the body just vanished, gone without a trace. "That's total fiction," I exclaimed. "A body can't simply get up and walk away." R nodded, then opened the file he was going to deliver to me. "Up to you whether you believe me or not. Me and some work friends called it the body snatcher." When opened the file, I saw some of the latest DNA traces found of Joshua's body, along with long strands of pure white hair. I couldn't think of what to say. I just sat silently, looking at the report. The hair was about the right length and color to belong to the albinos, but how could that possibly be? "You're welcome," R hummed, standing up before leaving my office. Left alone with my thoughts, I felt my stomach turn over. I'd seen the reports from the other crime scene, the boy lying in a pool of his own blood and brain tissue, clasping a small revolver in one hand. It could have been the lack of sleep. Things no longer added up in that case. Nothing made any sense to me. Theories buzzed and nagged at me. What if the death was faked? What if the body was stolen? What if... I stood up quickly, holding my head before groaning. The dead don't walk around, Harrison. Get a grip. My lack of sleep was clearly apparent now. Pushing the files into my desk drawer, I headed home, annoyed at R but also deeply puzzled. My alarm did little to wake me the next morning, although the pounding at my door did. Sharon, who was far too peppy for this time of day, had just gotten news that the laptop's files had now been copied and were free to read. I hurriedly got myself dressed, then left to join her. On the way in, She told me that they had found a full electronic journal, with the last entry being the day of Joshua's death. She was hopeful that this could be our route to finishing the case. Even if it was lacking detail, it could shine some light on the story leading up to the young man's death. Sharon pretty much sprinted to my office, where a hard copy of the journal had been placed. Instantly, she fumbled for the last entry. I, slower at my age, arrived just as she found the page. Sitting down in my own chair, I took out a notepad and waited for Sharon to read what it said. Okay, March 26th. She paused to find her words before a very puzzled look crossed her face. What's wrong? I asked. Nothing. Let me just read it. I could tell she was composing herself. Taking a breath, she started to read. I know God must be smiling upon me. My prayers have been answered, and I have him back. Robbed from me. I'd given up hope that we could be one again. But we will be. He doesn't know what he is now, but I don't care. He's an angel now. The moonlight shows his true form. It scared me at first, but I know this was meant to be. I'll become part of him. I lie with him now as I type this. His skin is so cold and pure, like snow. He's yet to wake up from last night. He bit him pretty badly from animal instinct, but he's starving. My angel is starving. Tonight I'm not going to fight him. We can make a thing of it before his mind is taken by the moonlight. If anyone finds this, finds me, just know that I wanted this. I wanted to save my angel from his hunger. There was just silence left between Sharon and me as she finished reading. Slowly, she placed the papers down, looking a little ill. He let this person kill him. What in the world was he going on about? An angel. Pulling my gaze away, I stumbled upon the file I recognized from last night. I bit my tongue, then struggled to form a sentence. I want to know everything. Who Joshua knew and who his friends were, those who went missing and those he moved apart from. In reality, I felt numb. This couldn't be real, could it? Sharon was as confused and disturbed as I was. Yes, Harrison. But what do you think he's talking about? He doesn't seem to be stable, I mean. The way he talks here is... Well, it's odd to say the least. What in the hell was going on? I remained silent for a while. I don't know. I'm going to ask around town and see if I can learn anything. I paused. Alone. Sharon just nodded, knowing I was as perplexed as she was about the whole business. Taking my coat, I left, planning on walking over to R's place to chat with him, to see if he could talk some sense into me. The walk across town was long and laborious, and I held my head down for most of the way. Moving my way through the waves of people, I drew closer to the building where R worked. The sense of dread that had hung over me ever since last night, which had strengthened after reading the journal, felt so much greater now. The face and form of the young white-haired man was etched into my mind. I quickened my step onwards. Pushing the door of the clinic open, I started to head over to the front desk to call for R, but that was when I saw him. Alone and sitting on the furthest most chair from the door sat a young boy. His clothes were tattered, his hair long and white. He looked like a ghost. His skin was marble. I felt a sharp inhale of air enter my chest. Harrison, what are you doing here? R called, walking around the corner. I snapped from my trance and grabbed his arms, trying to get him to listen. There, look there, As I turned to point to the boy, I saw that the chair was empty, as though I'd simply imagined him. R gave me a puzzled look. A chair? His accent sounded a little stronger than normal as he muttered, Are you okay? No words came out of my mouth, but I nodded, letting go of R. Let's get you some coffee and give you a place to sit down, okay? Without waiting for a response, R led me into a small conference room and got me to sit, before walking off to get some coffee for both of us. Taking long breaths, I tried to control myself. Don't let the stresses get to you. I tried to breathe slowly. Perhaps this was just a stress-related episode, but the only thing I could think about was Joshua and his killer, who in my mind was the white-haired teen. Before long, R came back, a folder under his arms, along with 2 steaming hot cups of coffee. I knew the man had an addiction to coffee and would offer or accept it at any opportunity. Passing me my mug, I felt myself start to relax, even before I started to drink. R sat across from me, placed his work down, then also started to drink. "What happened out there?" he asked after a short pause. "I don't know. I think the stress is getting to me," I responded flatly, hardly concentrating. R sighed, then smiled. "How old are you, Harrison? You're in your 60s now. Shouldn't you be living at home with your wife retired?" I glared at him for a moment. "Doctor's orders. You need to rest, Harrison. Look, I know you enjoy this, and your wife likes you to keep busy, but this job, this style of life, really isn't too good for you considering." My face softened and I nodded a little. "This case in particular, why don't you leave it to Sharon and the other boys at the station? They're all up to solving it. I just don't think you should be working with a case like this. Not after, well, you know. I've accepted what happened, R, and I don't want to retire. This job keeps my mind working." "No, it doesn't, Harrison. I can see it in your eyes. I'm saying this not as a doctor, but as your friend. You should stay with your wife and rest for a few weeks." R's voice had gotten softer. He knew my wife's time was short now. Finally, I nodded and agreed. For hours, I just chatted with R about life. Looking back, I guess I did need to cut down my work hours and spend more time with my lovely wife. Night was falling as I started to walk home. People were buzzing around, migrating back to their homes from their long work days. I felt better about life, more relaxed. Passing by shop fronts and restaurants, I started to instinctively look at people, blocking out the bad images with nicer ones. A couple were courting in the park under the old oak tree. One of the town's resident homeless was sitting at a bus stop with his large headphones on, tapping his foot in time with an unknown song. A proud giant of a man was walking home with his young son, carrying a bag of football kit. A young woman in a blue dress was exiting a small store named Transformer. I reassessed her gender shortly after. I found myself smiling, feeling the tensions of the case melt away. A girl selling roses, a man going to work at a restaurant, a white-haired teen in a light purple jumper looking over at me with dead blue eyes. I stopped abruptly and looked back. The teen had gone again, vanished into the crowds. My mouth felt dry. This was just stress, right? I quickened my steps, feeling my body pump with adrenaline. A cab sitting at red lights, a scruffy man walking down back streets. The white-haired boy again, his neck purple like it was bruised. I walked faster still. The sky was orange as the sun set. The building to my right had 5 floors. The dumpster around the corner house, 3 bin bags. The white-haired boy again, his face wet from tears, and pure white hair stained crimson. My eyes darted forward, away from the crowds, and fell on him again. One eye was golden and seemed to be ruptured, while the other was soft blue. His body looked so cold. I staggered back, but he'd vanished again, in the blink of an eye. Panicked, I started to run to the warmth of my home, my whole body shaking now. Breathless, I flew down my small street and fumbled for my keys before pushing the door open. Inside, I tried to catch my breath, taking lungful after lungful of air. Exhaling heavily and looked around. The money pot that stood on a small table by the doorway to the living room was smashed on the floor. So too was one of the lamps, a picture frame, keys. I felt as if time had stopped as I became aware of the sound of erratic breathing and gasping. I ran around the corner into my living room where I saw my wife convulsing on the floor. Her eyes were unfocused, one half of her face slumped to the side, her mouth half open. She was having another stroke. Lunging forward, I went to take her into my arms. But that was then I saw it. So, hungry, he murmured, one soft blue eye locked on my wife. He was thin, pale, cold. Moonlight poked its head out from behind the clouds for a moment, showing his true nature. Vast wings of pure light and a halo. Bloody white claws on both his hands and feet. Bloody neck, head and mouth, adorned with hundreds of sharp teeth. As soon as the clouds covered the moon again, he reverted back to the corpse he was. My eyes were locked on it. The angel of death that sat and watched as my wife died. It was as if something had taken over the body of a young man and now wore his skin, like a well-fitting glove. "What are you?" I screamed. Its eyes remained fixed on my wife, stiller now, hungry, starving. I turned to my wife, taking her in my arms. This seemed to confuse the angel, puppeteering the body it called home. It moved towards me and my wife. The moon shone on it again. The smell of rot was stagnant in the room. "Get back!" It didn't listen, simply moved closer, licking its long claws. I want it. For a split second it vanished out of sight, and my world went dark. I awoke to a pounding pain in the back of my head. I forced myself upright, before promptly clasping a hand over my mouth at what I saw. The starving angel was crouched over my wife's body, or what was left of it, pulling away at the chest, mindlessly, pushing flesh and muscle into its mouth. I thought I would vomit, but grabbing for my handgun, I took aim. His dead eyes looked at me through bloody white hair, not seeming to know or care what I was doing. "Get off her!" I screamed, before shooting all 5 rounds into its head. To my horror, the angel took every single one, reactionless. Every bullet fell back out the hole it had made, bringing a pungent smell of rot with it, before closing up. Though it was futile, I continued to click the trigger of my gun, though nothing came out. I shouted and screamed, but it just continued to eat. The neighbors arrived a short time later, reporting that they found me with the body of my wife, crying and screaming at monsters. Sharon and the rest of the police force arrived shortly after and took me to hospital and my wife to the morgue. No trace of the angel was found, but I know what I saw. I saw him at the funeral, at the side of my wife's grave, by the roadside, watching the world and all its death. Since that night, I've retired from the police force and live alone. Stress is causing me heart problems, and R keeps warning me I could have a heart attack if I continue to live the way I do. But I know I don't have much time left anyway, since the angel is back, and he keeps telling me he's hungry. I lie awake at night, the glow of his wings illuminating my room. If there is a God, he is nothing more than the monsters he has created. I can feel my chest getting tight as my heart fails me. I watched Hell's Civil War, the Iron Tower. It took a while for the circumstances of my death to come back to me. The memory was thrust back into my conscious mind during our descent into a swirling vortex at the base of the Iron Tower, as my companions and I escaped from one hellscape, only to be plunged into another. The end of my mortal life came during one wet and miserable afternoon on a war-torn battlefield in Eastern Europe. At the time, my platoon was deployed along a supposedly quiet section of the front, and I guess I got complacent. I recall being soaked to the skin as I trudged through the mud and scanned the gray horizon. I took a step and heard a sudden ominous click underneath my boot. A cold terror ran through my veins as my brain just had enough time to process what had occurred. A second later, the landmine I'd unwittingly stepped upon detonated. My last conscious feeling was one of intense heat, and then I was blown to kingdom come. And the next thing I remembered was waking up in hell, thrust into yet another bloody war. Although in this realm the battles are fought between demons and damned souls, rather than human soldiers and their high-tech weapons. What can I say about Dis, the ugly and worn-torn city where they sent me? The fifth circle is violence, and Dis is its capital. This is where most dead soldiers and generals end up. That's not to say there aren't honorable soldiers who fight for righteous causes. But the old saying is true: war is hell. The bloodshed and violence changes a man. It corrupts his soul and forces the mark of Cain upon him. And in the end, few, if any, escape unscathed. You can't die in hell, but you can suffer. They can blow your body apart, chop your head off your shoulders. But the suffering never ends. When I awoke in the afterlife, I was instantly confronted with the true horrors of Dis, experiencing the foul stench of death, seeing the medieval city burn under the flames of 1,000 fires, and witnessing towering demons and bloodthirsty harpies tearing lost souls to shreds. I suppose I should count myself lucky that I met 2 Dis veterans who took me under their wing. I knew little about Sebastian and Isabel, 2 damned souls who'd died in past wars before being dropped into the terror-filled streets of Dis. It was Isabel, the mysterious Amazon-like warrior, who'd explained the origins of the conflict. Minos was the gatekeeper of hell and former recruiter of Satan's army. But the serpent-like demon had revolted against Lucifer in an attempt to take control of the underworld and 9 circles. We were conscripts in Minos's ramshackle army, essentially serving as cannon fodder in the vicious battle for control of Dis. The press-ganged souls we served alongside had little loyalty to Minos or his cause. They fought for one reason only: the chance of freedom. Our demonic overlord had made a promise to his soldiers. More than anything, Minos wanted control over the Iron Tower, the tall and dominating monolith which was key to the entire fifth circle. If we could capture the tower and reach its summit, our master would give us a second chance at life and facilitate our return to the mortal plane. As far as we were concerned, this was a prize worth fighting for. But of course there was a price to pay, and it was a heavy one. The 3 of us literally leapt into the vortex which marked the entrance to the Iron Tower, as our former comrades burnt in an unholy fire behind us. I must have lost consciousness during the chaotic transition, because I awoke on a cold floor within a dark, windowless chamber, dimly lit by torches burning on the black and featureless walls. My companions were standing above me, Sebastian with his huge bulking frame blocking out the dim light, remaining silent as always as he looked down upon me with piercing eyes. To his right was Isabel, a thin smile on her dry lips, as she no doubt planned to say something clever or sarcastic. The woman exerted confidence, on the surface at least, but in reality, I could see fear behind her wide eyes. Sebastian offered me a hand and helped me to my feet while Isabel whispered in my ear, "Welcome to the Iron Tower, Jacob. Now the real fun begins." I ignored her attempt at humor as I surveyed our grim surroundings. The darkened chamber was small and tight, appearing to be an entryway to whatever lay inside the twisted tower. I noted the steel doors ahead of us, marked by strange and disturbing symbols. From the other side of the door, we could hear the muffled sounds of a deep voice, which seemed to be leading some kind of prayer. The heavy door was shut, and I didn't want to imagine what was occurring in the next room. But the door was the only way out of the chamber we currently occupied, and we had to move forward. And suddenly the fireball soared through the air and hit the helpless victim, engulfing his broken body in an unholy fire. The man screamed one last time before his body was burnt away, dissolving into ashes in front of our eyes. With the sacrifice made, the pentagram was consumed by a circle of white flames, which burnt fiercely as Lucifer apparently absorbed the victim's soul. And even though his physical body was reduced to cinders, we could still hear the victim's disembodied screams echoing throughout the chamber, as his eternal suffering had surely reached a whole new level of savage horror. I shuddered over what I'd just witnessed. That's not to say I wasn't familiar with acts of violence. I'd seen and participated in many such acts during my military career. But the normalization of the cruelty and savagery in hell was beyond anything I'd previously been subjected to. I continued to stare in mesmerized horror at the burning pentagram until I was shaken back to reality by Isabel. "We need to keep moving," she whispered. "We can't stay here." I nodded my head in agreement, as did Sebastian. The three of us moved forward cautiously, keeping our bladed weapons to hand in case we needed to fight our way through. But we were seriously outnumbered. I counted a dozen red-robed cultists in total, 13 if you counted their leader. I didn't fancy our chances if it came to a stand-up fight, and so we planned to sneak past the cultists in the slim hope that they wouldn't notice our presence. But of course, we weren't so lucky. In an instant, the dozen cult members turned their backs on the fire as they all faced in our direction. I still couldn't see their faces, which remained hidden under their hoods, but we could see their hideous eyes, burning red with a fiery intensity. Whatever these things were, they definitely weren't human. The daggers emerged next as all 12 cultists withdrew their still blood-soaked daggers and pointed them menacingly in our direction. The three of us formed a defensive line and prepared to fight as the armed cultists slowly advanced upon us. But to our immense surprise, their leader intervened as he called out to his bloodthirsty followers. "Do not attack," he ordered. "Let them pass. Their souls belong to the Dark Lord, and only he can decide their fate." His words chilled me to my bones even after the cultists wordlessly obeyed their leader's orders, withdrawing their daggers and standing aside to let him pass. We moved forward cautiously, keeping our weapons handy as we prepared for the possibility of a double cross. There was a second door on the far side of the chamber, which appeared to be the only way out of the room. None of the cultists attempted to stop our progress as we made our way past the scene of the brutal sacrifice. But to get to the door, we needed to pass the altar where the pale-faced warlock stood. His cold eyes followed us closely as we walked. I thought he'd keep his promise and let us go, but suddenly the warlock shot forward at incredible speed, heading straight for me and grabbing hold of my body before I had a chance to resist. He knocked the blade out of my hand with ease before taking a firm hold, pulling me so close as I was forced to look into his cold eyes and felt his icy breath against my skin. "Let him go," Isabel screamed, as she held her knife up to his throat. But the warlock didn't even seem to notice as he continued to stare right into my eyes. I shook uncontrollably in his tight grasp as he spoke his chilling words into my ear. But, to my surprise, he delivered what sounded more like a warning than a threat. "You are entering a hell beyond your worst nightmares and will be forced to face the darkest corners of your own psyche," he whispered. "You cannot trust anyone or anything. And remember one thing, Jacob. Evil begins in the heart, as impure blood is pumped through the arteries and corrupts the body. To defeat evil, you must eliminate the source." I didn't understand what the warlock meant, but was relieved when he released me from his icy grip. "Go now," he said, as I returned to my comrades. "Proceed to the next level." I led the way, still shaken by the encounter with the ghoulish entity. I placed my hand on the ivory handle and experienced a chilling foreboding as I opened the heavy door which allowed us to proceed to the next area. What we found behind the next doorway was a narrow spiral staircase leading upwards. It was similar to what one would find inside a medieval castle, except that the steps were forged from iron rather than carved from stone. None of us liked it. The stairs were so narrow that we could only proceed one at a time, and we couldn't see around corners, which meant we could be ambushed at any point. The staircase seemed like a death trap, but what choice did we have? None of us wished to return to the previous chamber to face those bloodthirsty cultists and their demonic leader. So, After a short discussion, we decided to ascend. Sebastian led the way up the spiral stairs. He was the strongest and so best placed to defend our small party from a sudden attack. Meanwhile, Isabel walked in the middle while I took up the rear. I don't know how many steps we climbed in our ascent. I lost count. All I know is that I was soon exhausted and disorientated. I think my companions were also tired and frustrated, and we weren't fully alert when the attack finally came. Sebastian let out a sharp cry, raising his machete to counter the swing of his enemy's blade. I heard the distinctive sound of steel striking steel, and saw what looked like a medieval knight on the staircase attacking Sebastian with a short sword. The attacker wore a full suit of black armor with an inverted cross emblazoned on his chest plate. He wore a helmet which covered his face, but I could see his eyes through the visor, eyes which burnt a demonic red. He screeched like a banshee as he swung his sword, and Sebastian struggled to defend himself as he desperately parried the attacks. Unfortunately, both Isabel and I were unable to help our comrade because the staircase was too narrow, but I would have problems of my own before too long. I heard the heavy stomping of footsteps behind me, turning just in time to confront a second attacker. Yet another dark knight charged up the stairs towards me. He was clad in the same black armor and seemed identical to the first attacker. His red eyes burned with a fiery intensity, and he let out a hellish wail before thrashing out with his sword. I reacted on instinct, using my own blade to block the attacker's sword, but the sheer force of the attack knocked me off my feet as I tripped on the steps. The fiendish knight continued his assault, attacking with his blade as I struggled to parry the hard blows. I don't think I would have lasted much longer, but thankfully Isabel came to my rescue. I remained on the ground as she thrust out with her knife, stabbing the knight in his throat, after expertly finding the gap between his body armor and helmet. A moment later, Isabel kicked out and sent the knight tumbling down the metal staircase. While this was happening, Sebastian gained the upper hand over the first knight, using his machete to saw through the enemy's neck. Our comrade made good use of his brute strength to cut through flesh and bone until he severed the knight's head completely. Next, Sebastian calmly lifted the severed head and held it aloft. To my horror, I noticed how the knight's red eyes were still burning as they looked down upon us. But Sebastian wasted no time before he tossed the head down the stairs, and it bounced off the iron steps before disappearing from sight. Jesus Christ! I swore in shock after the savage assault. Jesus didn't save your ass, I did, was Isabel's cynical reply. Now, get back on your feet, soldier. We're not going to carry you through this. I nodded my head as I got back up on my feet and lifted my blade. Isabel's warning was clear to me. I knew both she and Sebastian were determined to reach the tower's summit, and they wouldn't hesitate to leave me behind if I slowed them down. The last thing I wanted was to be left alone in this hellscape, to face the horrors which inhabited it. We proceeded up the staircase, stepping over the knight's beheaded body, whilst Isabel took this sword. We didn't know where the steps would end, and expected a further ambush at any moment. But miraculously, we soon reached the top of the staircase and were confronted by yet another steel door with an ivory handle. Both Isabel and I held back, staring at each other as if we shared a mutual feeling of dread at whatever lay on the far side. But it was Sebastian who stepped forward, placing his huge but now shaking hand upon the ivory before he slowly pushed the door open. We entered yet another dark chamber, dimly lit by torches and seemingly empty at first glance, although I noticed the foul stench emanating from inside. The chamber stank of rotting flesh and something even fouler, which certainly didn't bode well. Sebastian walked out first, and it quickly became apparent that something wasn't right. His heavy boots didn't march upon solid iron as we would have expected. Instead, his feet sank into wet mud, which apparently covered the entire floor within this latest hellish chamber. Sebastian looked back at us with anxious concern in his dark eyes. He'd sunk a few inches into the mud, and it was clear that our progress through this level would be slow and difficult. Nevertheless, we had to keep moving forward, no matter how tough our journey became. Isabel and I soon followed in Sebastian's footsteps and stepped into the inexplicable field of mud. We slugged through, struggling with each step as the mud hampered our progress. I could see the next doorway at the far end of the chamber, but this was a large room and it would surely take us a long time to make it across. Still, trekking through mud wasn't the worst horror I could imagine. But of course, the hellish chamber had yet another nasty surprise in store for us. I think I was the first to see it. A figure or creature emerging from the mud in front of us, digging its way to the surface and slowly crawling towards us. I shouted out a warning and pointed in that direction. But soon, more creatures emerged from underneath the muddy surface, all heading towards us. It was only when the creatures got close that I realized these entities were people, or at least they'd once been. Mud covered their faces and bodies, but I could just about make out their tattered uniforms underneath the grime and dirt. Their eyes were filled with madness and hunger, and their bodies were broken almost beyond recognition. Most were missing at least one leg, and none were able to stand upon the muddy ground. But they used whatever limbs they had left to crawl and push themselves forward. I counted at least 24, with more coming up to the surface with every passing moment. "Shit," Isabel swore. "We've got to move." Sebastian was the furthest forward of our trio, and so led the fight back. He tried to wade his way past the now moaning lost souls, but they grabbed and clawed at his legs and attempted to drag him down. Our comrade reacted with predictable violence, crushing skulls underfoot and slicing off their limbs and heads with his machete. It wasn't long before the ravenous souls reached me and Isabel, and we were forced to join the fight. The first living corpse attempted to bite my ankle before I brought my blade down, burying it in his skull. From that point onwards, I acted like a berserker, thrashing out and slaying zombie after zombie as I slowly fought my way forward towards the door and only exit. All three of us were fighting like hell, but we were seriously outnumbered. I glanced to my left and saw Isabel was in trouble, as 6 zombies had surrounded her. She cried out as the creatures clawed at her legs and started to pull her down into the mud. I moved towards her, wailing like a maniac as I started hacking and kicking. Before long, I'd slayed all the attackers, cutting their rotting bodies into pieces. I helped Isabel back onto her feet, and she shot me a smile whilst mouthing, "Thank you." I felt satisfied because I'd returned the favor and proved my worth, but we were still in significant danger. We continued the slow and desperate fight, trudging through mud whilst hacking our attackers up with our blades. The battle was tough and exhausting, but the three of us so nearly made it. Isabel and I managed to fight our way to the next door, but Sebastian lagged behind. I hadn't noticed during the violent chaos, but he seemed to be the main target of the legless zombies, as if they had a personal vendetta against him. We saw him about 10 yards behind us, desperately fighting against a host of the undead. They groaned and snarled in hungry anticipation, whilst grasping their victim's legs and biting into his flesh. Sebastian roared in fury and fought back with all his might, but there were too many for him. I wanted to run back and go to the aid of my stricken comrade, but Isabel stopped me, placing a firm hand on my shoulder and saying, "It's too late, Jacob." And sadly, she was right. Soon Sebastian's strength faltered, and the scrum of mud-caked bodies pulled him downwards. Our comrade dropped his machete and stopped fighting. It seemed he'd now accepted his fate. Sebastian looked towards us in the last moment, his eyes emotionless and his mouth firmly shut. I wanted to say something comforting to him but couldn't find the words. And a moment later, our comrade was pulled under the surface, his head disappearing into the mud as the old soldier faced an uncertain but surely horrific fate. I stood watching the now empty field of mud for a long moment before Isabel once again touched my shoulder. I turned to face my female companion and saw nothing but a steely determination in her eyes as she said, "We need to keep going. We've sacrificed too much to give up now." I nodded my head in silent agreement before placing my hand on the ivory handle and pushing the door open. Isabel and I both cried out in despair when we cast our eyes upon yet another spiral staircase leading upwards. I began to lose hope at this point, fearing that there was no escape from the dreaded Iron Tower, only suffering and torture throughout our endless ascent. Sebastian was gone now. We didn't speak his name or even verbally acknowledge his demise. I realized our ill-fated companion wasn't at peace. Instead, he'd surely been dragged to a deeper and darker circle of hell, where he'd be subjected to even worse torment. This would surely be our fate too, if or when we fell. I felt like dropping to my knees and screaming in despair, but I couldn't show such weakness in front of Isabel. After a short pause, we proceeded up the staircase. Isabel led the way while I followed. It seemed to make little difference, however, because an attack could come from ahead or behind. We proceeded slowly and with extreme caution, expecting to be assaulted by demonic knights at any moment. But when the attack eventually came, it was in a most unexpected form. I suddenly heard a low hissing from behind, turning to see a red serpent slithering up the stairs towards me. The snake was almost 2 feet in length, its reptilian eyes staring straight at me with a predatory zeal, as it continued to hiss aggressively and showed its sharp fangs. I shouted out a warning to Isabel before thrashing out with my blade and cutting the serpent in two. My victory was short-lived, however, as a moment later, I was assaulted by a host of multicolored snakes, which slithered over each other and up the staircase. The foul hissing was now near deafening, and I saw venom dripping from their fangs as their yellow eyes focused upon me. Isabel could not help, because the staircase was too narrow for 2 people to fight side by side, and so I had to defend myself. Desperately lashing out with my blade in a righteous fury, I culled snake after snake in the frenzied battle, and soon the steps were covered in their blood and guts, as the severed snake bodies continued to squirm and slither in a macabre display. I thought I had the vermin beaten, but one plucky serpent managed to get through my defenses and launch a vicious attack before I could react. The creature plunged its fangs deep into my flesh, causing me to scream in agony as I thrashed out to chop the snake in half. Next, I fell down on the steps as I grabbed hold of the serpent's head and tore it from my flesh, prompting another spike of pain. Fearfully, I looked down at the ghastly bite wound in my leg and soon felt nauseous. I swore I could feel the serpent's poison coursing through my veins, slowly corrupting every part of my body and inducing a horrific pain within me. I screamed again as my brain struggled to process the agony, and for a moment I thought I'd black out. But in an instant, Isabel was by my side, shaking me vigorously before slapping me hard across the face. "Damn it, Jacob," she exclaimed after the slap. "The venom can't kill you. You know this. It's going to hurt like hell, but you can't lose consciousness. Believe me, you don't want to give up now. You'll regret it for all eternity." I listened to her advice, somehow managing to stay conscious and get up on my shaking feet. My bad leg was going numb, and so Isabel had to support me as we struggled up the remaining steps before reaching the next door of cold steel. The chamber we entered was unremarkable at first glance. It was dimly lit and typically austere and featureless, but at least my nostrils weren't assaulted by a foul stench. And when we walked on the ground, it was solid. I was still in great pain, however, and so not fully aware of my surroundings or the potential threats within. Stumbling forward, I failed to notice Isabel's sudden change in demeanor as she no longer retained her tough and confident persona, and instead took on an uncharacteristic vulnerability. She let go of me and slowly walked towards the center of the dark chamber. I wondered what was drawing her until suddenly an inexplicable vision materialized in front of me. I thought I was hallucinating at first, but clearly Isabel saw it too, as she slowly proceeded towards the scene. What we saw was a representation of a child's bedroom, complete with a bed, cuddly toys, and cheap plywood furniture. The room looked entirely out of place in this hellish chamber, as did the young girl who sat upon the bed, humming to herself as she combed her doll's hair. The kid could only have been 8 or 9, her dark hair hanging long, and her hazel eyes shining with a childish innocence. The girl looked familiar to me, but I couldn't quite place her. She was obviously entirely oblivious to our presence, like we were outsiders secretly observing her private world. I felt very uncomfortable and unsettled, but noticed how my companion had become emotional, with tears openly rolling down her rosy cheeks as she watched the scene intently. Then all of a sudden, the bedroom door was violently kicked open, and a thuggish figure burst inside. The man looked huge compared to the little girl, his muscles bulging and face burning a bright red. I saw the thug clenching his fists as he screamed at the girl with a frightening fury. "God damn it, Belle. Didn't I tell you not to leave your bike in the driveway?" The girl was clearly terrified as she jumped off the bed and cowered in the corner whilst whimpering. "I'm sorry, Daddy." But his anger didn't diminish as he charged forward and grabbed her. "I'm so sick of this shit," he roared, before striking his daughter hard around the head. She cried out in pain, but this didn't stop the animal from hitting her again. Finally, the abusive father ended his sickening assault, leaving his innocent daughter bleeding on her bedroom floor as he stormed out of the room and slammed the door shut behind him. The scene of child abuse was sickening and disturbing, even compared to the horrors I'd already witnessed. Nevertheless, I didn't understand why the tower was showing this to us. But I soon got my answer. The girl continued to cry whilst rolled up in a ball on the floor. But suddenly a new voice could be heard, a disembodied, unnaturally deep, and decidedly inhuman voice, which chilled my very soul. "It's not going to stop, you know," he said. "Not unless we stop him." To my surprise, the girl responded as if she recognized the invisible entity speaking to her through the walls. "I told you to leave me alone. I don't want you here," she sobbed. "No more games, Belle." The voice replied sternly, "You know what must be done." "He's my daddy," she cried emotionally. "He'll keep hurting you." The voice added, "Only I can stop him. I am your last friend, Belle, the only one who can protect you. And I will save you, my child, if you only ask. I'll keep you safe forever, and all I ask in return is your love and loyalty." Those last words chilled me, and it seemed like an eternity passed before the girl finally answered, whispering her one-word answer just loud enough to be heard. "Okay." With that, the image of the child's bedroom disappeared into thin air, and we were alone once more. I looked to Isabel as she glared back at me, her reddening eyes now focused like those of a deadly predator. And suddenly it all came together inside of my confused brain. Isabel was Belle, and we'd just witnessed a memory from her violent past. She'd made a deal with something evil to escape from her abusive father. But now there was a price to be paid. The temperature in the chamber suddenly dropped to freezing, and Isabel's hard stare cut through me as she spoke slowly and carefully in a cold tone. "So, now you know," she began. My jaw dropped as I struggled to find the words to reply. "What did you do, Isabel?" I asked fearfully. I noticed how her hand was poised on the grip of her sword as she explained. "The Dark Lord saved me from that abusive asshole. He gave me my life back, and I've served him ever since. They used to call me the Angel of Death. Did you know that? I was a sniper, the best in the business. How many souls did I send down to my master? Honestly, I stopped counting after I reached double figures. Send them all to hell, that was my motto. I served Lucifer well in the mortal realm, right up until the day they dropped a 1,000-pound bomb on my head. I shook my head, hardly believing what I was hearing. I don't understand. I blurted out, "You fought for Minos, not for Lucifer. You recruited me into the rebel army." She smiled cruelly before replying, "I was never loyal to Minos. The Dark Lord sent me to infiltrate his forces and act as a spy within the traitor's army. I've performed this task to the best of my abilities, but what I really excel at is sending fresh souls to the ninth circle." She paused momentarily before delivering the killer line. "That's where you come in, Jacob." I noticed how she started walking slowly towards me, with her blade drawn. Sensing the threat, I started to back off whilst reaching for my own weapon. "Why?" I asked in confusion. "Why me?" She shrugged her shoulders whilst continuing her menacing approach. "Don't ask me. I'm just following orders. Lucifer wants you, Jacob. I guess he sees potential in you. But take my advice. Don't resist. This will all go a lot easier if you just let it happen." She smiled thinly, her eyes gradually changing color to blood red as she raised her sword to attack. But my heart was filled with defiance. Isabel had betrayed me, but I had no intention of going down without a fight. Nor would I ever willingly serve the devil. I was still suffering from the snake's venom and so in a weakened state, but nevertheless, a surge of adrenaline pumped through my corrupted veins as I launched a preemptive strike, thrashing out with my blade in an attempt to slice Isabel in two. She parried my blow, but this didn't deter me. Using my last reserves of strength, I struck again, this time slicing Isabel deep across her chest. But to my horror, she hardly seemed to notice the wound. Instead, my opponent merely laughed sadistically, her red eyes burning bright as she launched a retaliatory attack, deftly and precisely using her sword to test my defenses. I managed to block her first few attacks, but then she went low and cut my thigh. I screamed in pain and stumbled backwards. Isabel laughed again as she went in for the kill. I was weak and in a lot of pain, and I realized I wouldn't last for much longer. But strangely, at this moment, the cryptic advice of the warlock came back to me. Trust no one. Corruption comes from the heart. Destroy the source. Isabel clearly no longer considered me a threat as she raised her sword and prepared to cut my head off. I knew I had only one chance and so took a deep breath and made my move, thrusting my blade deep into Isabel's exposed chest. By luck or skill, I struck the right spot, the force of my thrust penetrating her ribcage and plunging straight into her heart. Isabel didn't seem to acknowledge the injury at first as she looked down at her wound in confusion. But suddenly she cried out blue murder, the red in her eyes fading as her body literally fell apart and dissolved into ashes in front of my very eyes. I stood in shock for a moment, hardly able to believe what I'd just witnessed. I reckoned Isabel was now with her master, in whatever hellscape he called home. The devil would surely punish my former companion for her failure to capture my soul. But this wasn't my problem. I did wonder whether everything she'd told me was a lie. Perhaps there was no way out of the tower, and I would never escape this vile place. Nevertheless, I had to try, even if there was only the slimiest chance of freedom. I was a wreck by this point, my leg sliced open and the serpent's poison still spreading through my system. But I wouldn't give up, finding reserves that I never knew I had as I limped through the chamber, opened the next door, and practically crawled up another staircase to reach the final room, where I would be forced to face my personal demons head-on. As I pushed through the heavy door, I stumbled into a chamber straight out of my nightmares. Before me was a fierce inferno, a house burning against a dark horizon with bodies strewn across a grassy field, as bloodthirsty killers whooped and fired their rifles into the air in the foreground. I physically shook as I slowly walked forward across the wet grass, which had inexplicably appeared underneath my feet, and felt the heat from the flames against my skin. There were tears rolling down my cheeks as I walked in a daze towards the inferno, and an immense guilt ate away at me. Because you see, I'd been here before, back during my mortal existence and the seemingly endless war I'd fought in. The soldiers celebrating this vile atrocity were my former comrades, soldiers turned crazed killers dancing in the heat of the fire they'd lit. And there was worse to come. I already knew what to expect, but the horrific scene I was forced to relive almost broke me. On the wet grass were 4 fresh bodies lying outside the burning house, each one showing the signs of multiple stab and bullet wounds as their innocent blood seeped into the dark soil. The children were the hardest to see, a boy and girl, both under the age of 10. I assumed they were brother and sister, once full of life and hope, but now lying dead in the dirt, their lifeless eyes staring up at the stars above. Their mother lay beside them, her dress ripped and breasts exposed. Her mouth was frozen in a horrifying death scream, and I knew she'd seen her children butchered before they finished her off. The last body was that of a white-haired elderly woman, all clad in black. Presumably, she was the children's grandmother, and she'd been shot through the heart. The final look etched on her wrinkled face was one of pained resignation. I turned away from the bodies in shame, looking with disgust upon my platoon mates who'd committed these murders and now celebrated their wickedness without remorse. I realized then why the tower was showing me this horror from my past. This atrocity was pure evil carried out by the hands of mortal men, and not even the deepest depths of hell could match what we'd done to one another on earth. I froze where I stood, my emotions overwhelming me as I sobbed uncontrollably and wished the ground would swallow me up. In a way, this is what happened, as the horrifying scene disappeared in front of my eyes. The burning house vanished, and the cheering soldiers were pulled into the darkness, and all that was left were the 4 bodies, except they were no longer the empty vessels of innocent souls. I could only watch in stunned horror as the dead rose, all 4 transformed into something vile and hateful, hissing zombies with ravenous eyes and gaping mouths. They advanced upon me with their hands extended like claws, apparently intent on gaining bloody revenge. For a moment I considered letting them. After all I'd done, I surely deserved this. But no, I wouldn't give in to the tricks of the tower. I had to keep fighting. At this point I could barely stand, let alone walk, as the pain from my injuries was nearly overwhelming, but somehow I summoned the strength to go on. Limping towards the steel door at the far side of the chamber, I could hear the vengeful ghouls behind me, rambling along slowly but making good progress, as they snarled and hissed in spiteful anticipation. I didn't turn around as I shuffled across the cold metal floor, my whole body aching with every movement. I got within 10 yards of the door before I collapsed in exhaustion, no longer able to walk, and so reduced to crawling. The zombies were right on top of me now, grasping and clawing at my dragging legs as I desperately tried to kick them off. I felt helpless as they began to drag me backwards, and I was sure I was done for. But, to my immense surprise, the attack ended as abruptly as it had begun. I turned my head in astonishment, only to see the murdered family standing and watching me. They'd suddenly ended their murderous assault upon me, and their dead eyes were no longer filled with hate. Instead, I saw a deep sadness in the women and children as they looked down upon me. It was almost as if they pitied me. All I could do was make a wholly inadequate apology, mouthing, "I'm so sorry." With that, I turned my back on the victims and continued my slow retreat, finally reaching the door and pushing my way through to the other side. I stumbled in surprise, only just stopping myself from falling over the edge. Amazingly, I'd made it to the summit of the Iron Tower, surviving against all the odds. I suppose I should have been relieved to escape the dark and seemingly endless staircases and hellish chambers. But the world I emerged into was hardly an improvement. Instead of sunshine, I was faced with a blood-red sky, and the air was anything but fresh, as my nostrils were filled with the foul stench of death, decay, and burning flesh. My weary eyes slowly scanned downwards as I heard the distant cries and clashes of far-off battles. Several hundred feet below me was the doomed city of Dis. Hell's capital was seemingly infinite, as all I could see in every direction was crumbling buildings and military fortifications. There must have been hundreds of fires burning across the hellscape, and the city streets were full of broken and torn-up bodies. But most chilling of all were the huge, towering demons who stalked the streets, 60-foot-tall giants whose roars filled the rancid air as they literally stomped on any lost souls still foolish enough to be caught out in the open. These wicked minotaurs were Satan's elite troops, the core of his vile army tasked with crushing Minos's rebellion. I had seen one when I first arrived in Dis, but that demon was dispatched by a horde of bloodthirsty zombies fighting for the rebel army. But it seemed the tide had turned. Lucifer's foot soldiers now dominated the battlefield as dozens charged through the city, crushing and destroying everything in their path. I noticed how they were advancing towards a central point, which I realized was the pyramid-like structure where we'd been briefed before we were sent into battle. Satan's forces were surely gunning for Minos, and I reckoned his foolish rebellion would soon be over. But I didn't care about any of this. I was done. The pain overwhelmed me as I collapsed onto the cold metal balcony, the tower's spire above me and the burning city below. I'd been promised my freedom if I reached the summit, but it seemed this had been yet another lie. I was distraught and entirely beaten. I did consider throwing myself off the edge, but what would be the point of that? This was hell, and I couldn't die for a second time. It seemed there was no escape, and I was in fact doomed to an eternity of torture and suffering. But suddenly I spotted something in the corner of my eye. A winged creature descending from the crimson sky above. At first it was little more than a dot on the horizon, but the flying entity was coming ever closer and evidently heading straight for me. Didn't have the strength to fight or flee. Instead, I merely looked up to see my attacker. But to my surprise, I was temporarily blinded by an intense white light which emanated from the winged creature. I shielded my eyes as the entity landed with a heavy thump on the metal, just yards from where I sat. Fearfully, I raised my head to observe the interloper. I expected a harpy or winged demon, an ugly and fiendish beast from hell's legions. Instead, I cast my weary eyes upon something ferocious yet beautiful. Towering above me was a tall humanoid figure, easily 12 foot in height, and clad in shining armor which covered her breasts and torso. I say she because the entity was definitely a woman, a stunning creature with long blonde hair and piercing blue eyes filled with strength but also compassion. She carried a mighty sword which would surely light up even the darkest of places, but she did not draw the weapon to threaten me. Instead, she spoke in a song-like voice which was both booming yet comforting at the same time. "Rest easy, my child, I mean you no harm." My jaw dropped as I struggled to speak through all my pain and shock. "What? Who are you?" I eventually muttered. I swore she shot me a smile through her ruby-red lips before responding. "I am Ariel, and I serve the one true Lord." I was in awe, not believing that something so beautiful could exist in a place so evil. Ariel was an angel, of course, but she was a long way from home. "Why are you here?" I asked sheepishly. "To observe," was her simple answer. "Look." She pointed her sword to the city below where an epic battle was about to occur. I could barely see him at first, but Minos used his great power to rapidly grow in size, and his body was soon the size of the demons charging towards him. He maintained the form of a bearded giant, but with a thick snake-like appendage wrapped around his immense body. The demons roared as they launched their assault with fiery swords in hand, but Minos remained calm, using this serpent tail to thrash out and strike the monsters. Several demons fell, their giant bodies collapsing and crushing the buildings beneath them. But the attackers kept on coming. Next, Minos used his dark powers to summon fire from thin air, propelling fireballs which consumed the advancing demons. Clearly, Minos was extremely powerful, but he was also heavily outnumbered, and soon began to falter under the relentless assaults. Then suddenly, the surviving demons stopped their attack, forming a circle to prevent Minos from escaping but not driving home their advantage. I didn't understand why at first, but then I saw it. Another huge, winged beast soared through hell's sky, but this creature was no angel. Quite the opposite, in fact. I froze upon witnessing the monstrosity, a gigantic dragon-colored jet black. The beast was easily the size of a bus, with a vast wingspan, burning red eyes, and a huge maw full of razor-sharp teeth. I had seen the monster before, shortly prior to my entrance to the Iron Tower, and I knew who he was. Lucifer, Satan, Lord of the Flies. The devil was here to deliver bloody vengeance upon the traitor. Minos looked up at the last possible moment and, even from a distance, I could see the terror in the giant's black eyes. The beast breathed fire, delivering a stream of white fire which hit Minos from above and set his exposed body alight. The giant cried out in agony as the dragon dived into him with its sharp talons exposed. 10 True Disturbing Demon and Ghost Horror Stories of 2025. Compilation 2. Story number 1. When I was around 12 to 14, I lived in my own house where some unexplainable things happened, like cupcakes falling over and chairs moving. But there's one memory that sticks with me and gives me goosebumps just thinking about it. I shared a bedroom with my twin, and we had bunk beds. I was on the top bunk. One night, I woke up at around 3:30 a.m. and was trying to go back to sleep, when suddenly, out of complete silence, I heard a creak from the bottom of the stairs. It was an old house, and I had been living in it since I was born, so I figured it was just the house being old. The sound slowly made its way up the stairs. I was facing the door, which was slightly open, so I could see into the hallway but not the stairs. I froze in fear. Once it reached the top, it stopped. I pretended to be asleep but had my eyes slightly open to see if I could spot whatever it was. The noise was so chilling. It finally stopped after what felt like forever, though it was probably only 5 minutes. I then worked up the courage to turn over and stuffed my face into my pillow to try and fall asleep. The next morning, I walked downstairs and found all the chairs huddled up in the middle of the kitchen. We ended up moving out of that house, and I haven't experienced anything like that again. I've had a few paranormal experiences, all within the house I lived in as a child. The first time I truly remembered one was when I was in high school. It was late, and I had just said goodnight to my family. I went into my room, closed the door, and got ready for bed. As I was lying down, no more than 5 to 10 minutes after resting, I felt what seemed like a hand pressing against the edge of my bed near my feet. I bolted upright, expecting to see my younger brother. However, upon inspection, no one was there. In fact, I could hear my little brother joking with my mom in the kitchen, which wasn't far from my room. There was no way he could have snuck out without me noticing, since there was a large space between the foot of my bed and the door. Freaked out, I bolted from my room, panicked, and tried to put as much distance between myself and my bed as possible. I ran into the kitchen in hysterics, where my brother and mom stared at me in bewilderment. I tried to explain what happened, but was told it was all in my head and was sent back to bed. I felt ashamed and embarrassed, since I had no proof of what I experienced, but I knew it wasn't in my head. Later, others who lived in that house experienced similar things, which proved me right. A few years ago, my sister and I stayed at my mom's house. We both had to stay in my sister's old room, which she always hated. She said spooky stuff used to happen there all the time when she was younger, but we shrugged it off as an overactive imagination. It was around 2 a.m., and we had been talking about everything and anything. I asked her to turn off the light since I was tired and wanted to sleep. About 3 minutes after the lights were off, we heard a super low, rough growling noise, like the sound the grudge makes before she attacks. I nervously asked, "Was that you?" She replied, "No." "Was that you?" Panic set in. I told her to turn the lights on. She tried, but the lamp fell off the dresser while we were both in full panic mode. "See, I told you this room is freaky," she laughed nervously. We slept with the light on that night. We weren't kids at the time. We were in our early 20s. Other freaky things happened in that room too, but I chalked it up to lucid dreams. A few years ago, something happened to a friend of mine. He was on vacation at his grandfather's place in a rural area, basically in the middle of nowhere, with the closest neighbor kilometers away. Like with many countryside homes, there was no proper plumbing, so the restroom was outside. At around 3 a.m., in pitch darkness, my friend decided to go to the restroom. Using the torch on his phone, he made his way there, did his thing, and before leaving, decided to take a photo. He opened the restroom door ajar and took a snapshot on Snapchat of all the darkness surrounding him. The idea was to show his friends how brave he was being alone in the dark. He almost dropped his phone because the latter wasn't true. In the picture, there was a dual view on the left, with the empty void just next to it. But in the dark, if you look closely, it seemed like a couple standing and facing the camera. The man appeared to be wearing a suit, and the woman in front was dressed in a red gown. He was really shaken by the image he had just taken. He quickly wrote, "Take a screenshot," and hit send to everyone, including me, while trying to muster up the confidence to return to his house. The explanation? We still don't really know what caused it. It may 100% be an illusion formed at just the right angle. It may also be Photoshop, but he has never admitted it was a joke in all these years. I still have the photo saved on my desktop, and I get shivers whenever I see it. About a month ago, I was sitting at the lunch table with my 6 close friends, like any other day at school. Something was off that day because my friend Amanda looked nervous. It wasn't long before she told me she had something to share with me later. I told her it was okay and that she could tell me now. So she did. Back in late July, Amanda had played with a Ouija board with another friend of ours. She was scared that I would be disappointed since we are Catholic, but I reassured her it was okay, that she could do what she wanted, and I wouldn't judge her. Anyway, Amanda asked me if I remembered when she played with the Ouija board. I said, "What about it?" She told me she hadn't shared what the ghost told her. They had met a ghost named Nick, who had died of obesity. Amanda said he wasn't evil, but Nick told her and our other friend that Amanda was going to die before she turned 20. Amanda told me he also said she would die because she was going to be thrown into a river by a close friend. I started to panic, thinking this meant me. I asked her who, and she said it was our other friend, Becca. I looked beside me and saw Becca talking to our other friends, completely oblivious to our conversation. I was terrified. I asked Amanda if she was lying, and she swore she was telling the truth. She even said she would put her hand on the Bible to prove it. I asked if she or any of our friends had moved the planchette during the session, but she promised they hadn't. She said they all agreed not to move it before they started. I had always told her not to mess with ghosts or Ouija boards, and now I felt scared. I would also like to add that the other friend who played confirmed Amanda's story. I just don't know what to think of it. Story number 2. About 6 years ago, I lived in a small town where everyone knew everyone. My grandmother lived a few miles away from us, in the middle of the woods. I used to love her house, but looking back, that house was pure horror. They had 100 acres of woods with not a house in sight. There was an old, abandoned barn they used for tool storage, but the rest of the property was unused. I was a kid, in 1st or 2nd grade, and every time I visited I slept in the spare bedroom, also known as the kids' room. The kids' room had a glass case mounted on the wall with at least 50 dolls all aligned and looking straight forward. My great-grandmother collected vintage dolls from every state. I was always petrified of that room, but didn't have much choice. One night, my sister and I were sleeping in the room, sharing the same bed. I woke up to find the room completely black, except for the dim hallway light. I remember seeing one of the doors of the case open, and one of the dolls started moving. Another time, I was in the kids' room alone. I couldn't sleep because of what I had seen last time, and that's when I noticed one of the dolls was out of place. Its head was facing the door, which was odd, because they were all mounted to the case and shouldn't have been able to move. The doll's head began to slowly turn and look at me. I was off-center to the left, so there was no way this wasn't paranormal. I sat there sweating bullets under my blanket, too afraid to yell for my grandma. I eventually passed out, and when I woke up, the dolls were facing forward again. They have moved out of the house since, and I think the dolls are in storage. However, they still own part of the land and use it for camping. My grandmother, who is almost 60, is in really bad shape, and my aunt recently left for college. So my family decided to move my grandmother in with us. My mother and I were almost done putting all of my grandma's stuff into storage. It was pretty late, around 2 o'clock in the morning, and the house's power went out. We were on our way back to the house with the very last of her belongings. I looked at my mom and said, "Hey Mom, I know this sounds weird, but I wish I had more paranormal experiences in my life." She laughed and said something unimportant. When we finally got back to the house, I realized my grandma's cat was in one of the rooms in a pet carrier. I knocked on the door and called the cat's name. As I walked away, I heard a cat hiss, followed by knock, knock, knock coming from the room. I'm only 15 and don't normally curse in front of my mother, but I ran out of the house screaming, "Holy!" My mom asked what was wrong, and I told her that I had knocked on the room with the cat, and it knocked back. She then told me, "That was the knocking. I thought you dropped something." She heard the knocking, and she wasn't even inside the house. Sadly, I had to go back in and get the cat. On my way off the front porch, my mom and I both heard something. The best way to describe it was the sound someone makes when waking up from a very deep sleep, a groaning sound. We got into the car as fast as we could and drove away. We told my grandmother about what happened. She told us that she heard knocking coming from that door every night. It would wake her up and make her think someone was breaking in. I even remembered her telling us about it a few weeks ago. I haven't been back to that house since. Story number 3. 3 years ago, my daughter attempted suicide and ended up in the ICU for 6 days. Afterwards, she spent 5 days in inpatient care. When she came home, unexplainable things started happening. We had lived in this house for 11 years, and nothing strange had ever occurred before. But suddenly we started finding dead animals, 2 carcasses to be exact, on our back porch steps. A knife flew off our kitchen counter while no one was in the room. We even placed the knife back on the counter and jumped to see if it would rattle off, but it didn't move. My daughter confided in me that she felt a demon had followed her home from the hospital. She would sleep at night with headphones on so she wouldn't hear the demon telling her things. I called a local paranormal research team to investigate. They found a spirit named Adam and a dark entity. They wanted to return after reviewing the evidence, but my husband refused. The scariest thing that has happened to me in this house occurred while I was in bed. I felt like something was there. I opened my eyes to appease my senses, not really expecting anything. But a very large, very tall, completely black figure was standing at the end of my bed. I realized half of the TV screen was blocked by this figure. I screamed and covered my head. When I looked again, I saw only the TV and the dresser, as normal. Since her first attempt, my daughter has been in and out of several facilities, 6 times in total. She is a shard of the girl I once raised. I used to be fit and care about my body, but I don't anymore. I have daily feelings of wanting to take my own life, but it's like they aren't mine. If that makes sense, I'm not suicidal, but somehow my mind convinces me that I need to perish. It's hard to explain, and sometimes I wonder if I'm feeling my daughter's thoughts. The most consistent physical phenomenon in our house is light bulbs exploding or blinking. While I was using the bathroom, 2 light bulbs exploded, and glass went everywhere. It was so loud, and so much glass shattered that it even reached the bathtub. Our living room lights also explode frequently, though never 2 at a time. Are we just going through a rough time in life, or is something more sinister happening? This is no joke. It feels very real to us. I don't know what to do about it. Any thoughts or opinions would be incredibly appreciated. Story number 4. I can still remember this quite vividly. A little background first. At the time, I lived in a creepy older house, a dual-unit Victorian. Sometimes my older sister and I would notice an unexplainable shadow from the corner of our eyes, even at the same time. We never let it seriously bother us, and anyway, there was always an adult around within earshot. One day my mom had just picked me up from school. Right when we arrived home, she mentioned that she forgot to buy an ingredient for dinner and said we needed to go to the market. I politely refused since I really wanted to watch Transformers. It was one of the 5-day special linked series. I think it was the return of Optimus Prime, and it was about to start. Heck, I'm a big kid now, a 6th grader. I'll be fine. She asked again to make sure, and I reassured her, reminding her that the neighbors, who were actually our relatives, were home, and I could go to them if anything came up. Before leaving, my mom talked to the neighbors to mention that I was home. Rejoice! Free at last. I'm the man of the house now. Immediately, I turned on the kitchen TV and broke out my Lego to play on the kitchen table. I was watching Transformers while playing with my Lego when I fumbled with a piece, which landed past the doorway into the adjoining hallway. I ignored it since I didn't want to miss a moment of Transformers. About 10 minutes later, I noticed the shadow in the corner of my eye, right where the Lego piece lay on the floor. I was freaked out enough that the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. But hey, Transformers was on, and I was a big kid. I decided to turn the volume up on the TV. Minutes passed, and I forgot all about the Lego piece as I became fully engrossed in watching Optimus Prime do his thing. Suddenly, something hit me on the side of the head. I distinctly heard a click-click sound as the Lego piece landed on the other Lego on the table. My internal alarm went off. I slowly turned my head toward the hallway, but the Lego piece wasn't there. Screw this. I bolted out of the house. Moments later, I was banging on my neighbor's door. I've never been into paranormal stuff, mainly because I've had enough activity happen to me over the years. Story number 5. This last summer, my friends and I decided it was a good idea to make our own Ouija board and play it at their house, and also at the cemetery. They asked questions, and the board responded with things I knew were true. Things they couldn't have written themselves. I could sense it was real. Then, out of curiosity, my friend Karen asked, "Will our friend Penny be pregnant at age 19? The board said yes. Fast forward a few months, and I got a phone call from Penny saying she was actually pregnant. In that moment, I was awestruck and freaked out at the same time. Nothing like that had ever worked before. Now I'm a little more freaked out knowing the board worked. I still can't believe it predicted something so insane. I'm kind of excited about the other stuff we asked, but I'm also very leery of it. Story number 6. I live with my husband in a large house in the country. We live right next to a large field, and past that is a wheat field. We love to take our pit bulls out for runs there. There's a street running horizontally from the field, as we live in a very tiny subdivision out in the middle of nowhere. This happened in June or July of 2014. I was sitting on the bed talking to my mom on the phone around 11 p.m. My husband was in the study down the hall. The 2 windows in our master bedroom faced the backyard. Everything was normal until I heard what sounded like a plane landing in our backyard. Only, it didn't sound like a plane engine in the slightest. It was so close to the windows and the ground that the house shook. The noise was so loud that I couldn't hear my mom clearly anymore. The sound freaked out my cat, and she bolted to hide under the dresser. I told my mom to hold on as I rushed to the back door to see what in the world was making such a loud, explosive engine noise. That's when I heard the explosion. Great. Now whatever was in the backyard just exploded. I threw the door open and saw nothing. Not a darn thing. The backyard was silent. Not a car, not a person, not a plane. Nothing. I assumed an 18-wheeler must have crashed outside. Perhaps they needed help, so I ran around to the front yard and looked up and down the horizontal road by the field for a crash. Nothing. All the noise was gone. I looked up the street next to us as well. No one heard it. I was the lone dingbat standing outside at 11 p.m. I went back inside and told my mom I'd call her back because now I was freaked out. I just heard what sounded like World War III, and there was no explanation for where it came from. I asked my husband if he heard anything, and he told me he felt the house shake a bit, but didn't hear anything since he was gaming with his headphones on. Apparently, even Castiel, our pit bull, didn't notice anything. She didn't bark or stir. I hope I explained this well enough because I'd really like to know what I heard. The noises had to have come from somewhere, right? I don't understand how our neighbors behind us didn't come barreling out of their houses, looking around for the source of the noise like I did. Any insight would be appreciated. Story number 7. When I was 16, I was bored at my girlfriend's cousin's place. Thai people are a superstitious bunch. I'm only half, but my girlfriend, her cousin, and her friend are all 100% Thai. We decided to make a Ouija board by writing letters and numbers on a piece of printer paper. We lit candles and politely asked spirits to join us. It was freaky how the coin we pushed around seemed to move so quickly and accurately, spelling out the names of our future boyfriends and girlfriends. I easily blamed Joey, the most excited of the group, for manipulating the coin. We decided to put our wager to the test. My girlfriend volunteered to have the only finger on the coin while the rest of us just touched her elbow. We also asked her to close her eyes, look up away from the board, and answer a couple of questions. After receiving no response, we asked our final question. "Is anyone here?" My girlfriend screamed, and we jumped back, stunned. We watched as the coin spelled stop. Her eyes remained closed. Her face turned toward the ceiling, with tears streaming down her cheeks. It continued for 30 seconds before finally letting her go. We tore the piece of paper up, flushed it down the toilet, and sat in stunned silence. My girlfriend said she had absolutely no control of her body. She wanted to look down and jump away from the board, but couldn't. I will never forget that night, and I've been convinced of the unknown ever since. Story number 8. When I was a kid visiting New Orleans, my family went to a voodoo shop. I wish I could remember the name, but it wasn't one of the tourist attraction shops. It was hard to find, and unlike all the others. I felt called to buy a little black doll made from cloth. It had no face or features, just black cloth in a human shape, stuffed and sewn together, It was sold as a voodoo doll of death. Thinking back on it, I feel pretty dumb for taking something like that home. Once we brought it back, many weird things started happening to my whole family until we eventually moved because of it. I often heard whispering in my room late at night in an unintelligible language. I also once heard an angry man say my name behind my ear as I was turning on the living room TV. I literally felt his breath. None of this my family believed when I told them. I was under 12, so it's understandable. What changed their minds and made us move the next day was this. My mom saw an orb come up to her face when she was almost asleep. She said she couldn't breathe for almost a minute while it hovered near her face. Then it flew into the corner of the room and disappeared. When we moved to a house close by, the new residents of our old house became our friends. They started saying their kids were hearing whispers at night. The crazy part is, we never told them about our experiences before they mentioned it. I'm not certain if all this is tied to the doll or not, but the stories I've heard make me think it might be. Story number 9. 2 years ago, my family moved into a very nice apartment complex in the Houston, Texas area. We were looking for a good complex, and were informed by the assistant manager that they had a model apartment that had been used for viewings. She mentioned it hadn't been occupied for a long time but was willing to lease it to us. We moved in a month later without giving it much thought. The apartment had a studio attic connected to the stairway. The attic was open, and from there, you could see the living room below. Every time the maintenance people had to come by, they were very quick to finish and leave. They never lingered in the apartment. Once, the maintenance manager remarked, "I never thought they were going to lease this apartment again." When we asked why, he quickly changed the subject and avoided answering. I worked as a graveyard shift nurse, so my wife and kids stayed home alone 4 nights a week. On my days off, I would stay up late watching TV. Around 1 to 4 a.m., I noticed a heavy, cold presence near the stairs, as if someone was watching me. The feeling was so strong that I would often leave the living room, convinced someone was standing at the stairwell, looking down at me. Fast forward a year. We moved out and into our first new home. One day I randomly told my wife that I felt comfortable in the new house and didn't sense a bad energy watching me. My wife turned pale and asked, "You felt that same energy too, watching you from the stairway in the early morning hours?" We both turned pale, realizing we had lived in an apartment that likely housed a spirit. To this day, we don't know exactly what happened, but we assume someone may have ended their life by jumping from the studio attic into the living room. The management had locked the unit for a long time before deciding to lease it again. Even now, no one in the complex will talk about what happened in apartment 2811. Story number 10. One night, I scared a bunch of people on night shift. I pre-recorded murmuring and random phrases like, "hello," and "you've made a big mistake" on my phone. Then, I connected it to a Bluetooth speaker and placed it in a room. Why? Because we planned to play with a Ouija board. The place I used to work at was nice. The median age of employees was roughly 23, and there were about 30 of us. Most were friends, but some of us were mischievous. Pranking each other was a daily routine, and even the CEO and COO would get involved, if only to laugh at the poor soul who got pranked. One night, someone suggested we play with a Ouija board. I couldn't pass up the opportunity to mess with everyone. The Bluetooth speaker was tiny, but it had a blue light that would be visible in a dark room. I covered the light with tape, placed the speaker inside an open box, and connected it to my phone. I was one of the biggest skeptics in the office, so if I acted scared, it would be very convincing. I used an office iPad to record the event, and everyone was aware of the recording. We all sat down and started holding hands. Since I couldn't take out my phone to play the audio manually, I had set the recording to begin after 5 minutes of silence. 5 minutes later, someone asked, "Is someone here?" Just as they did, A voice came through saying, "Hello." Everyone freaked out. It was perfect. Perfect timing. The murmurs started, and then a whispering voice said, "Don't mess with us," followed by numerous murmurs. Then the voice added, "Mark killed me. He killed me." I had to act freaked out. One slip, and I would give it all away. Then a coworker of mine let go of the hand he was holding and fell to the floor. He had passed out. We turned on the lights, and a few seconds later, he came to. We gave him water and calmed him down. Seeing the collective scare on my co-workers and the brilliant execution of my prank, I thought the best way to honor it would be to never tell them what I did. It's been a few years, and I'm sure there are 5 people out there still telling stories about the time they experienced a real ghost killed by someone called Mark. Now that God has revealed himself, none of us are allowed to die. It was a Thursday when God revealed himself to all of humanity. The day started ordinary enough, but sometime in the afternoon, I felt a presence in my chest and a voice in my ear. "I have returned," the voice said. As it just so happened that everyone had heard that voice, everyone felt that presence, and soon everyone stepped out of their dwellings and looked up at the sky and saw the clouds disappear and a brilliant light shine for just an instant, a moment, a light so brilliant it couldn't have belonged to the sun, and it had to have been something else. And it was clear. The feeling in our hearts was certain. The Lord was real, and he was here. What happened next was likely what you would have expected. The world became kinder, more compassionate, not by virtue of an intrinsic force of goodness overtaking us, but rather the fear of retribution. You didn't want to fight, didn't want to insult, didn't want to judge, because you didn't know what would happen when you did. A safe life, with the recent supernatural developments, was one that contained a bit more charity, a bit more turning the other cheek, and a bit more feigned grace. Fake it till you make it after all. I watched for signs of what would change next. We were all under the watchful eye, but at least felt, incorrectly, we would realize, that the Almighty's interventions had been minimal so far. Everyone found out at their own pace that death had become a thing of the past. Some knew immediately, when their loved ones in hospice care saw remarkable turnarounds in health. Others missed the memo until mass consensus had been established, when scientists and statisticians alike revealed that by every known metric, natural disasters, car crashes, heart attacks, that the number of daily reported deaths had plummeted from an average of 160,000 to 0. Life went on, and as it did, I started hearing whispers of what worship was. Depending on who you talked to, online or at the water cooler, you'd hear a different rumor, a different interpretation. It wasn't until my mom was called upon that I knew what it was. I remember it vividly. 7 o'clock, after dinner, Mom got up from her seat in the living room, got ready, donned her coat, stepped towards the shoe rack. "Where you heading, hun?" my father asked her. "I've been summoned." "I'm sorry?" "The Lord has summoned me for worship." I remember just how odd the moment felt. Life had been tinged with a certain unreality since the grand question was blown wide open. Seeing Mom head for the door both did and didn't make any sense. Had it been any other year, we would have thought she was doing a bit. "Did you, need a ride?" my dad asked confusedly. "The Lord would like me to walk," she responded. Then she turned the knob and went outside. I was 17 at the time. My brother was 20. We both asked Dad if we should follow her. He told us to stay home, that he'd accompany her and figure out what was going on. He didn't return until the next evening. We rushed downstairs when we heard the front door open, hoping we'd catch both parents entering. Instead, it was just him. Disheveled, weary, a muted expression on his face. I'll never forget the way he looked at us. She's standing in a field, he said. Then, there are other people there too. 4 months passed since Mom was first called to worship. During that time, we learned something more about God's interventions. The new commandments, as I termed them in my brain, were panning out as the following: Thou shalt not die, via disease, natural disasters, etc. Thou shalt be called to worship at a random time. Now I'll admit neither of those are as catchy as the OG commandments. This is, after all, not the official word of the Lord, merely just my reading of the tea leaves. Commandment 3 came to me in a dream. Kidding, it came to me in a YouTube video. It was your usual street fight video. 2 guys on a sidewalk corner, for reasons unknown, exchanging blows, until the bigger of the 2 got the upper hand and started wailing and wailing, then secured a knife and, like a light bulb went off in his head, stopped, lifted himself from his rival. The guy getting his ass handed to him stood up also, and then both of them just walked. Single file, empty expressions on their faces. Manchurian candidate shit. So, if thou attempt to kill another, thou shalt immediately be summoned to worship, was the takeaway. But what, pray tell, was worship really? I visited my mom one afternoon to understand better. The spot she had journeyed to was an hour's drive from home, so she must have trekked for hours that first night. I arrived at the field, to the sight of thousands of people standing evenly spaced, 3 feet apart in every direction. They all faced the same way, heads tilted slightly toward the sky, perfectly still. No movement. I maneuvered the rows for what felt like an endless amount of time. When I finally found her, it genuinely felt like I just got lucky. It was my first time seeing her since she'd been gone. I had mentally convinced myself that there was no need for me to come out here. After all, she'd be coming home any day now. Mom, I'll admit I was a bit emotional. To my surprise, despite her fixed posture and eyes tilted up, her mouth moved. Hi, sweetheart. How are you? I'm well. I am in worship. She wasn't totally being herself. Mom, are you able to move? I am in worship, she repeated. But do you want to come home? The softness in her tone didn't change, but it did seem like she was imbuing her words with some kind of subtext, trying to say something more. I can't, love. And then, enunciated even clearer, I think you should go home, perhaps before you're forced to stay too. But, home. Get going now, dear. I told her I loved her, then departed through the gathering of worshippers, all of them laid out so absolutely perfectly. Like a chessboard, everyone had their spot. And there was plenty of land to go. So much so that I had to wonder what spots myself, my friends, dad, older brother, and everyone I'd ever loved would potentially occupy one day. En route, I spotted a few other visitors. They looked more morose than I was. They whispered words of affirmation and love to their respective persons, hearing responses sure, but said responses from the corner of their loved ones' mouths, seeming light, quiet, curt, God-centric, like they were standing at someone's gravesite, albeit more a statue than a grave, a commemoration of someone long gone. But no one was really gone. Mom hadn't left. Worship would be over soon. It had to be. Maybe another couple of weeks, couple months at most, and then she'd be home, and the Lord would call someone else to take her place. When thou art in worship, thou shalt not age. Commandment 4 became common knowledge a year later. The amount of folks called to worship had steadily gone up during this time. This was global, of course, so anyone curious could at any time look up a live stream of the designated worship areas around the world to see people standing uniformly, frozen, perfectly spaced, in parks, beaches, city squares, you name it. Every town, every city had its place. My place, I supposed, would be the same field where Mom was, unless it filled up by the time it was my turn, in which case it could very well have been somewhere completely random and unknown. The no-aging revelation was again something discerned by the ever-decreasing amount of practicing scientists on the planet. Outside of worship, life was still progressing normally, more or less, except for that final, tricky death step. Worship grief was a real term now, the experience of losing someone to God, essentially. Not yet coined was the secret counterpart buried in all our brains, that God knows, literally, we weren't brave enough to speak. Worship, fear. I tried my best to keep my thoughts pure. I couldn't help but assume that thoughts of blasphemy contained within the 17 or so centimeters of my brain were fair game for our omnipotent ruler to scrutinize. It was a nice fantasy, though. The idea that there might be a spot, a street corner without God's CCTV camera. Somewhere you could just be you without fear that your insubordination would expedite the ticket to your special place on God's canvas. Support groups existed, and so I joined one, and that's where the no-aging element of worship was first pitched to me as one of the many pros of the whole construction. I didn't find Commandment 4 comforting, but I smiled and nodded nonetheless. The world was still the world, but less so. I'd take the train to work and notice that the average of people's expressions had gone from tired and cranky to subtly mortified. I once saw a woman break down and start crying, and I can almost swear she said under her breath, "I don't want to go." Or maybe I was just projecting. Nightmares weren't the same anymore. The worst dream I could have now wasn't one where I was being chased by a murderer or caught in a storm, rather the one where I would stop in place while I was doing something mundane. I would hear a voice in my head. The voice would say, "You have been summoned." My feet would start walking on their own, and I'd know exactly where I was going, even if I didn't know where it was. I'd jolt awake in my bed, sweating, praying, funny as it were, that I still had executive function. That, and the little moments where I'd feel a random twitch or spasm in my leg. Those were the killers. The fire fizzled as soon as it reached him. The blade froze in midair. The explosion never happened. Thank goodness, really, as the camera footage eventually discovered and uploaded was gold. And then our friend got up from his seat, still dripping and flammable, and walked out of frame. Commandment 5, my friend. Commandment 5. The other was the video of that big streamer who kept faking that he'd been summoned while live on Twitch. His face would go blank, he'd get up from his seat, and he'd mechanically step out of his room. He'd done the fake out so many times that when it was the real thing, chat was in denial for hours, hilariously horrifying. People still worked, still clung to routine, but it was pretty fruitless. I'd see street preachers with a megaphone, telling us that our time was soon. Like, no shit, my guy. Apple, despite most of their workforce having clocked out permanently, still managed to come out with new products somehow. Streaming was mainly reruns, however. Probably hard to commit to a full season of material when your director, lead actor, lead writer, and everyone else on set could step out at a moment's notice and never come back. Less workers everywhere you went, but hey, it made sense. Less customers and all. I picked up a coffee from the Starbucks in my area that still had employees and went off to see my brother. It had been 2 years. His was the hardest one for me. After all, I knew deep down he wouldn't have wanted me to pity him. But holy shit, did I? I returned to the parking lot. It was much busier with people now. At capacity, it seemed. I maneuvered the gaps and finally got to him. "Hey," I said. "Hi," he said. "How is it?" I saw his chest expand and contract with his steady breaths. Head lifted, eyes angled up. "How is it?" I asked again. "I'm in worship," he said. "And it'll probably be my time soon, too," I said. "Help me prepare." Again, he said nothing. Bro, I said. It took him a while to finally speak. You know, he said, the thought I think about the most is that some random bullet could be flying around somehow. Just a random bullet, fired from hundreds of miles away, and it gets past God's radar, and it catches me in the back of the head, and it all goes black for me. It's my favorite thought. It's the dream that's keeping me going. I didn't say anything. I couldn't say anything. There's a feeling in my chest, a sureness. This isn't going to stop. I felt trapped. It's gonna go on for eternity. No heat death. Just this. I put my hand on his shoulder. An empty gesture, really. I think I just needed something to help keep me upright. Please find a way to kill me, he said. And then I had to go. I think I heard him say, please stay, I need conversation. Or maybe I imagined it. Or maybe I heard it bang on clear, but I didn't want to think about it, because it made me feel like shit. Survivorship bias is a really strange feeling to have when you're still on the sinking Titanic. Sure, your section of the ship isn't submerged yet, but you would be there soon enough with Leo and the gang. Whoever was keeping track had stopped counting. Almost everyone was gone. It was dumb luck, pure and simple. Dumb luck that I hadn't been called upon yet. My soft research started the moment Dad disappeared, but you can be damn sure it escalated after the conversation with my brother. I approached everything with an open mind and tried anything I could. Specific meditations, incantations, prayers to the Lord for the global worship session to end. I went to specific coordinates in towns where, rumor had it, people could actually die. My trips were immeasurably disappointing. No death to be found anywhere. The old constants, death and taxes. The new constants, immortality and worship. I was en route to my 80th or so desperate attempt to find salvation. See, annihilation. A picture of a flyer that was shared to one of the many holy shit we need to die ASAP groups I was a part of detailed the church that one Reverend Lucien Ferrer was practicing at. He made lofty promises about his support group that I was sure he wouldn't be able to deliver on. The bottom of the flyer reading much like a pyramid scheme. Join a community with a surefire solution to worship fear. No testimonials because we have a 100% success rate. Come and see the miracle for yourself. But desperate times and all that nonsense. I made the 4-hour drive. On the way spotting some of the many new landmarks of people gathered, perfectly spaced apart, facing the same direction, heads slanted upwards, locked in perpetual admiration for the Lord. It felt like my time was closing in, like I'd stop the car any moment now, step out, walk along the side of the road until I reached my place. I arrived at the destination. The church looked desolate from the outside, looked long abandoned. No clue what Reverend Lucien was running here, but hey, if it was just a prank, he got me. I stepped inside, and then I felt it. The lack of the feeling of the Lord in my chest. It felt like my bond with the Creator had been severed. By the entrance there was a table with a sign-in form and a pen. I scribbled my name and the time. The interior stretched quite long. I took a seat in the pews. There were a few others seated in the rows. They looked like they'd been waiting for quite some time. After a little while, a man came out on the stage. Just going to be a couple more hours, but he should be seeing to all of you soon, he said. It felt like I was at the doctor's office for an appointment. He didn't reappear for quite some time, as promised. Time stood still. I heard the tick-tick-tick of the clock. My hands on my legs. Don't move involuntarily. Don't move involuntarily. He came out, called someone else's name. Thomas Gilmore? Is Thomas Gilmore here? And sure enough, Thomas got up from his seat and followed the man to the back. Tick, tick, tick. Eve Merritt? Eve? That's me. Her hand shot up. That's me. And off she went to the back. Tick, Tick, tick. I really, truly didn't know how much time I had left. It just says Lily here, he said, eyeing the sheet. Lily? She's just in the bathroom, another stranger said. All right, we'll take her when she's back. And then the sun was going down. How long would this support session run for? I couldn't wait for them to close up shop for the evening. I couldn't come back tomorrow. I couldn't wait. I couldn't fucking. All right, got a Jake Miller here? Jake? Me! I shouted. Immediately, I stood from my seat. I had the horrific thought that my body would turn itself around. I'd leave the church and walk right into the sunset. But instead, my footsteps made their way up the aisle, and then I was standing right in front of him. To the back, he said, and I followed him there. A rather confusing and twisting pathway past closed doors, boxes, mess, and hallways until we got there. To a confessional booth. In there? I asked him. In there, he said. I entered the booth. There was blood on the seat. Blood. What a novel sight. Take a seat, don't worry about the dried. It's fine, you'll be good. Sit, said who I presumed was the priest sitting on the other side of the partition. I did as he requested. Reverend Lucian? I asked. It took him a second to respond, to register. Yes. Reverend Lucian, sure. I continued. I haven't really done this confessional thing before, but I guess, are you supposed to ask me to confess something? Yes. Please confess whatever is on your mind. I took a second to gather my thoughts. Right, yes. So, I heard the sound of something being cleaned by a cloth, followed by a deliberate, echoing snap. Was he eating? Right, so I saw your ad, found your ad rather, and, I suffer from worship fear, I guess. I don't want to, commit blasphemy against the Lord or anything, but I heard the echo of another bite. Jesus, a little rude man. But, not sure if I want to stand in a field for 100 years. In a worship, I guess. It's not 100 years, he said, chewing loudly. It's forever. Eternity. That was his little project. His little what now? Heaven on earth. Eternity. That was always the plan. For all of you to become one with the Lord for the rest of time. Of course he wanted to show up when there was the most people, right? He said, crunching. Like probably. He stifled a laugh. Probably less exciting when it's fucking cavemen, right? Billions of people? Or 10,000 cavemen? Which would you choose? I'm sorry, what does this have to do with anything? Nothing, sorry, please continue. Right, I said, gathering. And, no. I guess that was it. It said you have a surefire solution? On your ad. Yeah, he said. I can kill you. You can kill me. Yeah, right here, right now. Of course, if you need time to think about it, it's a no. And if you step out of the church, God will summon you right then and there to be a part of the flock. That's what? How would you know that? What's your answer? There are people waiting, and I'm a busy guy. Busy, Reverend. The answer would be yes, but that'd be in violation of Commandment 3. Sorry, I guess. You don't know what that is. Basically, I've been trying to keep track of everything, and Commandment 3 is my shorthand for the whole. If you try to... Suddenly, the partition fell. Swiftly came the knife into my jugular. I couldn't believe it. Blood spilled onto my shirt, my legs. I gagged, my vision blurring as I tried to focus on the man who delivered the blow. The man who had a bloody knife in one hand, half-eaten apple in the other. The Lord and I have an agreement, he said. He has his space, and I have mine. Albeit this one is much smaller than what I'm used to. I felt my head lower involuntarily. My eyes acclimated to the final shot, myself drenched in red. You're welcome, I think I heard him say. and then it all went black. A Dead God. Part 1. My name is Dr. Stephen Rolston, researcher at the Martian University of Creven. What follows aren't really research notes as much as they are a way of keeping me sane. I need them to truly grasp the magnitude of our discoveries, to keep the order in my mind, if you will. For as long as historians could remember, humanity had been looking for their God, but to no avail. Despite several millennium of searching, no deity was ever found. This never became a real issue, though, until the late 22nd century, when we invented the ships needed to explore space outside of our own solar system, the telescopes required to truly peek far into the universe and technology, allowing us to drill deep into the earth. Humanity had turned their eyes to the skies and to the planetary depths to look for answers. Neither heaven nor hell was ever found, however. Throughout the 23rd century, the disappointment grew, and a new church rose. Their priests preached about a dead God, believing that ours had somehow died. The religion had its major breakthrough in 2267, and by 2300, they had already converted over a third of the people to this new belief. The necrotic church had more power than it could ever need and grew stronger every year. My story begins a good 20 years later, however, with me waking up for another day of research. I aim to find a definitive answer to the age-old question, where is God? I refuse to believe he died. 24th August, 2322 AD. I decided to visit the observatory today. My research had been stale these past few weeks, and I felt I could use some new insights. There is only so much one can learn from the history books after all. It always strikes me as odd, though, whenever I talk to the scientists there, how we still have not discovered intelligent life. This in spite of our technological prowess and our planet colonizing habits. I feel it would be a solace, though. I guess I just do not want to be alone. Probably goes for all of us. To be honest, I would already settle for a few ruins, some scriptures perhaps, anything but the animalistic species that dominate every habitable planet we come across. I digress. There actually was an exciting new discovery made which my colleagues there told me about. They had discovered a new species of gaver-like creatures, albeit with much more flexibility in their claw-like fingers, deep in the bush forests of Titan Major. Apparently the beasts had exhibited an irrational fear of the explorers, but that was not the strange part. Although the creatures, Vedans Titan Arashiro, displayed no exceptional cognitive abilities, they had somehow crafted numerous human-like statues out of the thin wood found there. The statues vary greatly in size, from a few inches to close to 10 feet, but apart from gender differences, they are almost exactly the same. I do not know what to make of it. Adam and Eve? Eden? I need some sleep. 27th August, 2322 AD. I received a message from Gerald as I woke up today. He urged to call me back right away. Apparently he had been trying to reach my cell all night. After all those years, he still did not remember that I could not sleep with that thing turned on. Not that it mattered much these past few nights. My research will not let me sleep, and even if I do fall asleep, I have to face the nightmares. I will not be writing those down here, however, as it is best if I just forget them. But I digress. Eager to catch up, I called Gerald during breakfast. I did not think too much of his calls during the night back then, for he had done so before. "Good morning, Dr. Starr. I hope you slept well," I began. "What? Are you alone?" He promptly interrupted me. "Yes? Yes, I am." "Good. Well, Dr. Rulston, I have some good news for you," he said, sounding like his old self again. "If they have not brainwashed you yet, of course." "They do try," I laughed. "What news do you have?" "You should come back to Earth, Stephen. At least that church does not control everything here yet." He explained to me how there was a whole community of like-minded scientists in Tokyo, some of them atheists. Gerald gave me a contact number of one of the Martian members, From what I understood, the scientists were split into two research groups. One branch aimed to find heaven or any sign of God in the galaxy. The other held on to the belief that God lived inside all of us. It is a shame I know Gerald to be a firm believer of the latter, for it would be a pleasure to work together again. Searching the galaxy sounds like a much more exciting prospect, however. 30 August 2322 AD. Church confiscates alien artifacts, read the heading on the news website today. Can you believe that those priests actually did that? The first alien craftsmanship we ever found, and they are claiming it and probably burning it soon too. No scientist will be examining those wooden statues. On a more cheerful note, I finally met the other scientist Gerald had told me about. The Martian chapter operated in a state-of-the-art research facility on the crater plains near Cravan. I was able to explore the entirety of it with chief researcher Dr. Havard as my guide. He explained to me how they had found several rich benefactors, mainly older religions, to take care of the financial aspect of their research. Most of the funding was used on the observatory, however, and it was magnificent. The telescopes there were unlike any I had ever seen before, both in scale and effectivity. Furthermore, Dr. Havard assured me that those were not even the most advanced models they had. In the hallway stood a number of brand new telescopes still wrapped up in their packaging, and several parts of a legitimately giant one laid scattered across the floor. I also took the opportunity to ask him about the news I heard today, though I now wish I had not. You heard the news today? I asked. About the church's latest confiscation. Yes, I did, he nodded, and I'm afraid there is even more to it than that. Come, walk with me. He led me through a series of highly secured doors into another wing of the research center that I had not seen yet. We entered a large chamber that was stacked to the brink with computers. There were huge touchscreens on both walls and at least a dozen engineers manning the technology. This is what I like to call the war room, Dr. Havard said. In here we gather all information we can on the necrotic church and their activities. Now, about today's news, we have reason to believe that they did not only confiscate the statues, but exterminated the whole species that crafted them as well. He spoke. What? Who knows what we could have found out by studying those animals? These thoughts will not let me sleep. What could the church be planning? 10 September 2322 AD. The workload over the last few weeks has been enormous, and I have not had much time to write down my thoughts. These are turbulent times, but I will get to that later. Now, since I am one of the scientists at the facility without extensive prior knowledge of astronomy, Dr. Havard had me doing mostly paperwork. I had to check the planets that had already been discarded by the other researchers to make sure that they were nothing special, check reports on the church in the war room, and listen to the incoming radio signals, or rather radio static from outer space. Most of it was not that exciting, but it left me plenty of time to talk with the other scientists there and focus on my own research. To be fair, it was not so bad at first, but then the church began tracking us down. To make matters worse, we could all follow it in the war room. We could see how the bastards were systematically hunting us all down, forcing us to slow our research down and keep a low profile. I have to admit that I was and still am frightened. The facility itself is pretty secure, but the risk of getting caught in your own home grows day by day. It feels as if we are running out of time. With so many of my colleagues being captured, my workload increased immensely, and I even got to help with the telescopes. It was then that I was finally initiated in the true progress that the facility had already made. Something, out there in the galaxy, was moving, and we had no clue what it was. The only proof we had of its existence were our calculations seeing the light had not even reached its part of the galaxy yet. But whatever it was, it had our whole facility confounded, as it did not seem to follow any of the laws centuries of scientific progress had come up with. 1. Our object does not move in a logical pattern and appears to be unaffected by gravity. 2. Our object seemingly pulls and releases other celestials in its vicinity at will, without any kind of foreseeable pattern. 11th September, 2322 AD. Those are not even the most disturbing things about whatever we found out there. I was not even supposed to be clued in about what follows, so perhaps I should not write about it either, but I do not feel like I have a choice anymore. This is too much. Here is my attempt at transcribing my conversation with Dr. Havard, as he had called me into his office today. "Dr. Ralston, have a seat." "Tea?" he greeted me. "Well, I do not mean to be blunt, but why did you call me in here?" "There is just so much work." "Ah, yes." "You picked up on any signals yet?" He answered blankly. "Well," I began until my eyes met his. "Fear?" "There is a reason I called you in here, Stephen. Our numbers are dwindling, and seeing as how you've helped greatly over the last few weeks, you deserve to know." He sighed and handed me a file. It was about the galactic anomaly we had discovered. The calculations show that our object's gravitational pull is so strong, so very powerful, that it is affecting the orbit of this very planet, as well as every other one. Dr. Havard resumed. "What? But we are dealing with something far beyond what we'd thought was rationally possible," he continued. "Beyond what we—" Dr. Havard fell silent for a moment and then looked up and started whispering something of which I could only decipher the word life or alive. I was frightened already. It felt as if I just stood there for hours, not knowing what to do. The man simply stared at the ceiling with that creepy blank stare. I had finally managed to open my mouth as he looked at me again. "We found God," he whispered. "We did." Isn't that a bit rash?" I answered, shivers running down my spine. "No, we did." His eyes were full of steely conviction. "And he knows. It's all in the file, how the light has stopped moving towards it ever since we discovered him. We still can't see further into that sector of space than we could 4 months ago." "That can't be right." "It is, but there's more." He grabbed the file out of my hands and began flipping through the pages. Here, at exactly 10:06 a.m. yesterday, his movements ceased being random. His eyes grew wide. "But he is coming. Our Lord's on his way, and we are not prepared. I must remain calm and focused. I must be calm and focused. I am calm and focused. I am so. Am I?" 12th September 2322 AD. As was to be expected, I barely slept tonight. In the morning, I could not get up though, and it was not until noon that I finally admit that I would not find the answers in my own home. So many questions kept rushing through my mind as I checked my email during breakfast. Surprisingly, Gerald had sent me a document overnight without any further information. A Dead God. Part 1. My name is Dr. Stephen Ralston, researcher at the Martian University of Creven. What follows aren't really research notes as much as they are a way of keeping me sane. I need them to truly grasp the magnitude of our discoveries, to keep the order in my mind, if you will. For as long as historians could remember, humanity had been looking for their God, but to no avail. Despite several millennium of searching, no deity was ever found. This never became a real issue, though, until the late 22nd century, when we invented the ships needed to explore space outside of our own solar system, the telescopes required to truly peek far into the universe and technology, allowing us to drill deep into the earth. Humanity had turned their eyes to the skies and to the planetary depths to look for answers. Neither heaven nor hell was ever found, however. Throughout the 23rd century, the disappointment grew, and a new church rose. Their priests preached about a dead God, believing that ours had somehow died. The religion had its major breakthrough in 2267, and by 2300, they had already converted over a third of the people to this new belief. The necrotic church had more power than it could ever need and grew stronger every year. My story begins a good 20 years later, however, with me waking up for another day of research. I aim to find a definitive answer to the age-old question, where is God? I refuse to believe he died. 24th August, 2322 AD. I decided to visit the observatory today. My research had been stale these past few weeks, and I felt I could use some new insights. There is only so much one can learn from the history books after all. It always strikes me as odd, though, whenever I talk to the scientists there, how we still have not discovered intelligent life. This in spite of our technological prowess and our planet-colonizing habits. I feel it would be a solace, though. I guess I just do not want to be alone. Probably goes for all of us. To be honest, I would already settle for a few ruins, some scriptures perhaps, anything but the animalistic species that dominate every habitable planet we come across. I digress. There actually was an exciting new discovery made which my colleagues there told me about. They had discovered a new species of gaver-like creatures, albeit with much more flexibility in their claw-like fingers, deep in the bush forests of Titan Major. Apparently the beasts had exhibited an irrational fear of the explorers, but that was not the strange part. Although the creatures, Vedant's Titan Arashiro, displayed no exceptional cognitive abilities, they had somehow crafted numerous human-like statues out of the thin wood found there. The statues vary greatly in size, from a few inches to close to 10 feet, but apart from gender differences, they are almost exactly the same. I do not know what to make of it. Adam and Eve? Eden? I need some sleep. 27th August, 2322 AD. I received a message from Gerald as I woke up today. He urged to call me back right away. Apparently he had been trying to reach my cell all night. After all those years, he still did not remember that I could not sleep with that thing turned on. Not that it mattered much these past few nights. My research will not let me sleep, and even if I do fall asleep, I have to face the nightmares. I will not be writing those down here, however, as it is best if I just forget them. But I digress. Eager to catch up, I called Gerald during breakfast. I did not think too much of his calls during the night back then, for he had done so before. "Good morning, Dr. Starr. I hope you slept well," I began. "What? Are you alone?" He promptly interrupted me. Yes, I am." "Good. Well, Dr. Rulston, I have some good news for you," he said, sounding like his old self again. "If they have not brainwashed you yet, of course." "They do try," I laughed. "What news do you have?" "You should come back to Earth, Stephen. At least that church does not control everything here yet." He explained to me how there was a whole community of like-minded scientists in Tokyo, some of them atheists. Gerald gave me a contact number of one of the Martian members. From what I understood, the scientists were split into two research groups. One branch aimed to find heaven or any sign of God in the galaxy. The other held on to the belief that God lived inside all of us. It is a shame I know Gerald to be a firm believer of the latter, for it would be a pleasure to work together again. Searching the galaxy sounds like a much more exciting prospect, however. 30 August, 2322 AD. Church confiscates alien artifacts, read the heading on the news website today. Can you believe that those priests actually did that? The first alien craftsmanship we ever found, and they are claiming it and probably burning it soon too. No scientist will be examining those wooden statues. On a more cheerful note, I finally met the other scientist Gerald had told me about. The Martian chapter operated in a state-of-the-art research facility on the crater plains near Kravan. I was able to explore the entirety of it with chief researcher Dr. Havard as my guide. He explained to me how they had found several rich benefactors, mainly older religions, to take care of the financial aspect of their research. Most of the funding was used on the observatory, however, and it was magnificent. The telescopes there were unlike any I had ever seen before, both in scale and effectivity. Furthermore, Dr. Havard assured me that those were not even the most advanced models they had. In the hallway stood a number of brand new telescopes still wrapped up in their packaging, and several parts of a legitimately giant one laid scattered across the floor. I also took the opportunity to ask him about the news I heard today, though I now wish I had not. "You heard the news today?" I asked. "About the church's latest confiscation." "Yes, I did," he nodded, "and I'm afraid there is even more to it than that. Come, walk with me." He led me through a series of highly secured doors into another wing of the research center that I had not seen yet. We entered a large chamber that was stacked to the brink with computers. There were huge touchscreens on both walls and at least a dozen engineers manning the technology. "This is what I like to call the war room," Dr. Havard said. "In here we gather all information we can on the necrotic church and their activities. Now, about today's news, we have reason to believe that they did not only confiscate the statues, but exterminated the whole species that crafted them as well." He spoke. "What? Who knows what we could have found out by studying those animals? These thoughts will not let me sleep. What could the church be planning?" 10 September, 2322 AD. The workload over the last few weeks has been enormous, and I have not had much time to write down my thoughts. These are turbulent times, but I will get to that later. Now, since I am one of the scientists at the facility without extensive prior knowledge of astronomy, Dr. Havard had me doing mostly paperwork. I had to check the planets that had already been discarded by the other researchers to make sure that they were nothing special, check reports on the church in the war room, and listen to the incoming radio signals, or rather radio static from outer space. Most of it was not that exciting, but it left me plenty of time to talk with the other scientists there and focus on my own research. To be fair, it was not so bad at first, but then the church began tracking us down. To make matters worse, we could all follow it in the war room. We could see how the bastards were systematically hunting us all down, forcing us to slow our research down and keep a low profile. I have to admit that I was and still am frightened. The facility itself is pretty secure, but the risk of getting caught in your own home grows day by day. It feels as if we are running out of time. With so many of my colleagues being captured, my workload increased immensely, and I even got to help with the telescopes. It was then that I was finally initiated in the true progress that the facility had already made. Something, out there in the galaxy, was moving, and we had no clue what it was. The only proof we had of its existence were our calculations seeing the light had not even reached its part of the galaxy yet. But whatever it was, it had our whole facility confounded, as it did not seem to follow any of the laws centuries of scientific progress had come up with. 1. Our object does not move in a logical pattern and appears to be unaffected by gravity. 2. Our object seemingly pulls and releases other celestials in its vicinity at will, without any kind of foreseeable pattern. 11th September, 2322 AD. Those are not even the most disturbing things about whatever we found out there. I was not even supposed to be clued in about what follows, so perhaps I should not write about it either, but I do not feel like I have a choice anymore. This is too much. Here is my attempt at transcribing my conversation with Dr. Havard as he had called me into his office today. "Dr. Rolston, have a seat." "Tea?" he greeted me. "Well, I do not mean to be blunt, but why did you call me in here?" "There is just so much work.